Hey there! Before we start, this video combines together all my mini APUSH topic review videos without the AP style questions at the end of each video. If you'd be interested in trying AP style questions associated with each topic, my full APUSH review playlist will be in the description. I just want to really quickly note that earlier units in this course might have a little lower editing and audio quality. As the course progresses, my editing and microphones got way better, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, let's get into the entire AP US History course review. Topic 1.2 is all about societies in the Americas before the contact of Europeans on the continent. The starting thing to know is that before Europeans came into contact with America, there were many societies that existed inhabited by various Native American tribes. For this video, you need to know how they lived in the Americas. The crop of maize, or corn, became a staple food of many of these native societies, especially the ones in the Southwest, as the cultivation of maize taught these societies advanced irrigation techniques and supported economic development. One of the most notable tribes thriving from this was the Hohokam, who built extensive canal systems for irrigation. In the Great Basin and the Western Great Plains, many tribes saw the dryness in the area and lived by always moving around and not making permanent settlements. Examples of tribes in this area were the Ute and the Shoshone tribes. The Northeast was much different. The Atlantic and the Mississippi River allowed for permanent villages to be made, with these societies functioning on agricultural obligations and hunter-gatherers. A notable tribe in this area was the Cahokia. And this was actually very similar to the people in the Northeast and present-day California area, as they also supported themselves on hunting and gathering and used the Pacific shoreline as a good place to build settlements, with one of my favorite tribes in this area being the Chinook. Last video we talked on societies in the Americas before Europeans came in contact. Well, Mr. Christopher Columbus arrives onto America in 1492, and that changes the way of history for the Americas forever. Essentially, the various European countries decided that they were going to explore and conquest this new land. The reasons for this are very simple. It's the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. First, Europeans wanted to gain more wealth, which was at the time measured in gold and silver under a system called mercantilism. Since there was a lot of gold in the Americas, conquering land allowed for mines to open up and more wealth going to European countries. The second reason was that Europeans saw the native civilizations in the New World and felt a kind of religious obligation to spread and convert the natives to Christianity, with a special effort from Jesuit missionaries. Finally, there was glory. Back then, the more land a country controlled, the more powerful it was considered. The Americas offered a new frontier to claim and show off to the rest of the world. Topic 1.4 is all about the Columbian Exchange and how it impacted Europe and the Americas. So first, we need to define the Columbian Exchange. By definition, the Columbian Exchange means the transfer of goods, foods, animals, flora, fauna, diseases, and slaves between the Americas and Europe after European contact in the Americas. Essentially, what happened is when European countries came to America, various things got transferred from one continent to the other. The Americas had revolutionary crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco that got transferred to Europe. The influx of these foods to Europe caused there to be a population boom, and the transfer of goods allowed for Europe to shift from an economic system of feudalism, where land was owned by nobles and worked by peasants, to capitalism, where trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. Also during this time, maritime technologies underwent massive improvements, such as the caravel and astrolabe, meaning it was easier for people to explore. What also made it easier was the implementation of joint stock companies. This was a company that a bunch of people could pool their money into, so if it did well, they would all earn money. If not, they could only lose their initial investment, so it was very low risk. These joint stock companies were the companies funding these voyages to the Americas. As for Europe's effect on the Americas, yes, there was goods, foods, and animals brought to the Americas like wheat, rice, horses, and pigs. But the biggest thing that came from Europe to the Americas was deadly diseases. Europeans had been living with diseases like smallpox and measles for many centuries and had gained a sort of natural immunity to them. The natives, however, did not have the same immunity, and therefore when these diseases got introduced, it's said that 50 to 90% of the native population died because of them. Topic 1.5 is all about slavery in the New World by the Spanish. In my last video, I didn't go much into detail on this, but along with goods, foods, and diseases, slaves were also transported during the Columbian Exchange. The reason for this was, well, we first need to go back in time. When the Spanish landed in the New World, they wanted to harvest the goods and crops of the land, and therefore decided to enslave the natives through the encomienda system. This was a system where Spanish conquistadors were granted the right to extract labor from the indigenous people living in a particular area. In return, the conquistadors were to provide the natives in this area with religious Christian guidance and take care of their welfare. However, in practice, these obligations were often neglected and poorly fulfilled. This enslaving of the natives wouldn't end up working though, for two reasons. First, the natives knew the land that they had lived on for centuries better than their European guests, and therefore could escape pretty easily. And second, the natives were dying in mass numbers by smallpox, and you can't enslave a dead person. The way Spain solved this was by transporting slaves from Africa to the New World on ships with the brutal journey known as the Middle Passage and work the land. This solved both problems because the Africans wouldn't know the land, and they have the same natural immunity to smallpox that Europeans did. With these many Africans on the continent, it allowed for a caste system to form known as the casta system, where natives and Africans were on the bottom and anyone with Spanish blood was on the top.
Topic 1.6 is all about different views in the world during this time, along with some organized military resistances. So it's fair to say that any time in history, when an existing culture interacts with a new culture, misinterpretations and profiling will always happen from both sides. In terms of the natives and Europeans, their cultures had different worldviews on religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. Over time, Europeans and Native Americans adopted some useful aspects of each other's culture. But as Europeans increasingly attempted to enslave the natives, different military defenses from the natives happened. A few examples of this were the Capul Uprising in the Yucatan and the Taino Rebellion in the Caribbean. And even though documents like the Requerimiento tried to justify harsh treatments of the natives, it sparked debates from around the continent of how Africans and Native Americans should be treated. Though these arguments did exist, any arguments often led to Europeans justifying their treatment of Africans and the natives using culture or race as an answer. Unfortunately, that is most of what early US history is about. On the screen. Topic 2.2 is about not just Spanish efforts in the New World, but the French, Dutch, and British efforts as well. So I should preface this all by saying that the Spanish were not the only ones in the New World, though they were the forerunners. Other European countries came in too after hearing of the riches of the New World. Let's start with a little review on the Spanish. So the Spanish find the New World and try to enslave the natives under the encomienda system. This, however, faced criticism throughout the country, so in some areas they replaced their system to the repartimiento system, which was supposed to be less exploitive and for shorter periods. But it still led to horrid conditions for the natives. In an attempt to justify their colonization, the Spanish forcefully converted a fair amount of the natives to Christianity. And after the slavery of the natives didn't really work, they transported slaves from Africa and enslaved them to work under a system called asiento. Okay, that's the Spanish's way in the New World. Now let's talk about the French and the Dutch. They were a lot nicer to the natives and sent few Europeans to the continent and attempted to make trade alliances along with marry some of the natives in an attempt to build economic and diplomatic relations to export products like furs to Europe. With the French making their Great Peace of Montreal in 1701, and the Dutch continuing to build their fur trade empire through strategic alliances focused on cooperation. And finally, the English. English men and women migrants like John Smith and John Winthrop were attracted to the New World for 4 reasons. First was social mobility, as they believed they could potentially raise their social standing moving to the New World. Next was economic prosperity, as colonists believed the Americas were a gold mine where they could potentially grow wealthy from. Third was religious freedom, as groups like Puritans, Pilgrims, and Quakers were being persecuted in Europe, and especially England, causing them to seek new grounds to worship freely. And finally, improved living conditions, as the colonies offered a new life and new opportunity that could be better than living in Europe. Once the colonists moved to the New World, English settlers often took land from the Native Americans, sometimes through treaties, but more often through force. And the colonies they created centered their economies on agriculture, but more on that next. So we're gonna have some fun with this video, all about British colonies and how they functioned. But before we get to that, I need to tell you about English arrival into the New World. So the British come into the New World and expect to find vast amounts of gold in Virginia and along the Atlantic coast. This ends up not happening, but the Americas still offered the British cash crops like tobacco and rice, so they end up making farms in their various colonies. The people on these farms were mostly indentured servants, who were English workmen and women that in exchange for passage to the New World, they would have to work the land for a set number of years, which would normally average around 7. Now this worked for a while, but after a while there was a shortage of indentured servants, along with the growth of African slavery, which inevitably caused indentured servitude to fail. Now, to talk about the British colonies, I have for you a random woman I paid off a $5 to voice over this part of the video.
Hey there, Future Max here. Unfortunately, in this original video, I used copyrighted music, so instead of that British lady, I'm gonna pop in and explain this to you instead. Basically, your idea here is that all British colonies are different in some way. For example, the Chesapeake Bay and North Carolina regions were known as tobacco colonies, mostly because the region got rich on the labor-intensive crop tobacco, specifically relying on tobacco exports. Originally, labor for this tobacco would be grown by indentured servants, but quickly, once indentured servitude declined, African slavery would mostly take its place. Let's move over now though to the New England colonies, which were settled by the Puritans. Specifically here you had rocky soil, meaning farms literally couldn't be big, so instead we have small farms. In this area we also see shipbuilding, fishing, and lots of trade. This will mean the area is defined by lots of family-based communities, along with lots of religion and tradition. Now let's move over to the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York. These ones will specifically be known for their grain production, which is why you might hear them be called bread colonies. These colonies will be very diverse, with people like Germans, the Dutch, English, and many more, meaning there will be lots of diversity and tolerance. The last one we have here though are the Southern Atlantic plus the British West Indies colonies. These ones are going to be your plantation economies, where you'll see cash crops being farmed like sugar in the Caribbean and rice and indigo in the South. It should also be noted that most of the labor for these plantations will be done by slaves, meaning the majority of the population in most southern colonies will actually be African slaves. Alright, that's it for me. Let's get back to Past Max, who really needs to learn how to edit a video better.
Cheers, mate. One thing to notice is how unusually democratic British colonies at this time were. Like, the New England colonies ran on town meetings, and the southern colonists were ran by elite planters with elected assemblies, which were basically unheard of at the time. The most notable of all is to talk about the Chesapeake Bay colonies, with a special emphasis on the town of Jamestown in Virginia, which was the first official permanent English settlement in 1607, and was easily the most popular of all English colonies with its tobacco exports and its unique government style.
Topic 2.4 is all about the transatlantic trade. The main thing to take away from all of this is all Europeans really wanted from the New World was profit. Crops in the New World were so unbelievably profitable by the Europeans that, heck, there's an argument that without the crop of sugar, there is no African slave trade. And as goods and slaves were being transported, a system of trade known as the triangular trade, where European ships carried manufactured goods such as guns, cloth, and alcohol to Africa in exchange for African slaves to be transported to the New World and have them undergo the Middle Passage, which saw Africans chained and tightly cramped together in ships to the New World. And finally, in the Americas, the enslaved Africans were sold and the ships were loaded with raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then transported back to Europe. As you can see, this way of trade resembles a triangle, which is why it's known as the triangular trade. This trade would also cause diseases like smallpox to be spread to the New World and syphilis to be spread to Europe. Meanwhile, in North American colonies, the British government continuously attempted to incorporate their monarchical and hierarchical structure in the colonies for the point of earning the most wealth, which would inevitably receive pushback from the colonists and the American Indians, with one such example being the Bacon's Rebellion, where after the governor of Virginia refused to expel the Native Americans from Virginia, a man named Nathaniel Bacon rebelled and with a group of around 400 followers tried to overturn that decision and kill the natives. Although the British suppressed this rebellion, it highlighted the potential for colonists to revolt, foreshadowing the larger conflicts that would lead to the American Revolution.
It also contributed to the decline of indentured servitude, just so you guys know.
Topic 2.5 is all about the interactions between Native Americans and Europeans and how it changed from my last video on topic 1.6. The basic thing to know is that even before European contact, Native American tribes always fought each other. Now we start seeing Native American groups ally with European countries in an attempt to once again fight against other tribes. But even though this did happen, we still see Europeans expand and encroach on Native American land, with a prime example being Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War, which was the bloodiest battle in American history relative to the population of the time. This war started because English colonists broke treaties made with the natives and continued to forcefully expand past the natives' land, and with the killings of a few people along with some other reasons, the war began. King Philip was with the Native Americans and fought against the colonists along with a few Native American tribes. In the end, it was said that over 7,000 people died, and the colonists ended up winning. The effect of the end of this war was the sort of end of Native American power in the New England colonies. Though most all Native American resistances failed, there were a few that succeeded. one of which was the Pueblo Revolt, where the indigenous Pueblo peoples successfully revolted against the Spanish. The aftermath of this was that it led to the Spanish accommodation of some aspects of American Indian culture in the Southwest. But this would end not really mattering, as decades later the Spanish would end up taking the land of the Pueblo peoples. So we already know that there was a shortage of indentured servants, and therefore the British started participating in the African slave trade. The system that African slaves were employed under the Spanish was called asiento, but in English colonies they were employed under a separate system known as chattel slavery, where slaves were treated as property and not people. These African slaves worked heavily in the Chesapeake Bay and southern Atlantic coast, but the majority of them were in the West Indies. As chattel slavery became dominant, the interracial relationships between colonists and slaves became illegal, which made Africans only breed with other Africans, and new laws were put in place that their children would automatically be slaves. I know, it's awful. But even with this level of hopelessness, some Africans rebelled, with an example being the First Maroon War. But most that didn't rebel tried to survive by maintaining their own people's culture, one example of this being the Gala community, which maintained African traditions such as dancing to West African music during their rare moments of relaxation. So I've talked a lot on slavery and the African slave trade in colonies, and it's because that slavery was a massive aspect of colonies. In topic 2.7, we move away from the connotation of slavery and talk about other societies' cultures. The fact is, in all European colonies, there existed lots of different religions and ethnic groups, causing acceptance of diversity in colonies, and the word for that is pluralism, along with varying degrees of intellectual exchange. European leaders saw their colonies in the Americas as moneymakers and nothing else. The actual truth was that these colonies made their own unique culture and way of democratic governance. European leaders continued to clash with their colonies on things like the Navigation Acts, which lowered trade with their colonies and ended up hurting the colonies. The Enlightenment also started in Europe, which was an intellectual movement of reason and science. This would have a heavy influence on colonists later when the revolution would start with the ideas like freedom of religion and equality. But in this video, all you need to know is the initial response to the Enlightenment in the colonies, which was the First Great Awakening. This occurred in the colonies, where it saw the revival of Christianity in the British 13 colonies. This Christianity was traditionally the British's form, being Anglicanism, but it shifted throughout decades in the First Great Awakening to branches of Protestantism like Baptists and Methodists. We also see a rise in the spread of Protestant evangelicalism. The transatlantic prig culture also started in the colonies, where you start seeing the communication via press. The fact is that this culture had a different way of life, government, and reason that differed from European thought. Europeans didn't really like this and frequently clashed with their colonies. That, however, is something to talk about next unit. Topic 3.2 is on the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So to start this one off, I'm going to ask a question. What was the First World War? You might say, well, World War I, because it has a 1 in it. Some historians, however, would argue the 7 Years' War was the First World War because there was involvement from countries all over the world. The fact is, this war is complex and was fought in many theaters, but for AP US history, we will only examine the US side of things. This war started because of territorial disputes, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, and mostly in the New World between the British and the French. British peoples were moving to the colonies in massive numbers, and this forced the British to expand, threatening French-Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. But let's be real, this might be the official cause of the war, but Britain and France had beef before this war, and this was kind of the chance for them to settle that beef. The French and British had allied with many native tribes, and so colony armies combined with Native Americans would fight in this war. The war started with the Battle of the famous Fort Necessity, which the British lost. Notice the number of troops on both sides of this battle. It's very small. The only thing you should maybe know about this battle is it featured the general of George Washington. In the early half of this war, it's fair to say that the British were heavily losing. The French just kept winning each battle, and the British were just sleepy. I mean, take a look at the Battle of Monongahela. The French had around 400 troops, and the British had 1,300. Despite having 3 times the manpower, Britain still lost this battle because of their conventional line infantry tactics, as opposed to the French and Indians' guerrilla warfare tactics. However, the tide turned after 1758, as Britain leveraged its superior naval power and resources to gain the upper hand. Key victories at Quebec and Montreal in 1759 and 1760 were crucial to their successes, and finally in 1763, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the war ended. By this point in the war, there was so many more forces than the beginning. There are two big outcomes of this war that you should know. First, the French lost almost all of their territorial claims in the Americas, and they were split up amongst the British and the Spanish. The second is that this war made both Britain and France heavily broke. For Britain, this resulted in the imposition of new taxes on the American colonies, but I get ahead of myself. In France, the financial crises caused by the war was one of the factors that led to the French Revolution. After the British victory, imperial officials attempted to prevent colonists from moving westward, and this generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. Now we start talking about the causes of the American Revolution, which usually brings up two fields of thought: philosophical causes and direct causes. This video will be on the direct causes, being the British taxation. So the basic question to ask here is, with so much diverse peoples in the colonies of the Americas living different lives, how exactly is this random group of people going to come together enough to incite a revolution? The answer is a common enemy, and a few other reasons. The British had become heavily in debt because of the 7 Years' War, and therefore started taxing their colonies in the Americas through acts. 1764, the Sugar Act was passed, where the British taxed imported sugar. 1765, the Stamp Act was passed, which required colonists to purchase stamped paper for any document. 1767, the Townshend Acts are passed, which put taxes on imported goods like paper, paint, and tea. These three acts finally started getting colonists to think. The fact is, the American colonies were subject to British laws, including taxes, but had no representatives in the British Parliament to voice their interests or concerns. The British argued that they did have a voice by proxy, but the colonists denied it. The Sons of Liberty was a group who boycotted and protested against the British. The Stamp Act Congress convened, where representatives from several colonies met to formally protest the Stamp Act. Also of note was efforts of people like Ben Franklin, who helped rally colonists into one united culture. In 1770, continued British military presence in the colonies caused the Boston Massacre, where English soldiers fired upon revolting colonists and killed 5. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act, which put a tax on tea, which everybody was drinking at the time. This caused the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped the tea into the British harbor. This all led Britain to passing the Intolerable Acts in 1774, which closed the British harbor and gave a hit to local governments. By 1775, these issues, along with others like restrictions on westward expansion and stuff we'll go over in next video, had set the stage for the outbreak of the American Revolution. The American Revolution causes leads into two fields of thought: philosophical and direct causes. This video is on the philosophical causes. So if you remember back in Unit 2, I said the Enlightenment also started in Europe, which was an intellectual movement of reason and science. This would have a heavy influence on colonists later when the revolution would start. So around the same time all these taxes are being imposed by the British, the Enlightenment is running rampant through Europe. And because of the Atlantic world, these Enlightenment ideals get spread to the British colonies. First we have John Locke, who argued in his book Second Treatise that every person is born with a natural right to life, liberty, and property. And this might sound familiar, as this exact idea is written into our Declaration of Independence. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued in his book The Social Contract that when people live under a government, they enter into a so-called social contract, where they give away some of their freedoms for government benefits. And finally, we have Baron de Montesquieu, who argued in his book The Spirit of Laws that there should be a separation of government into 3 branches. And there were plenty of philosophers like Voltaire and Hobbes who argued against European government style and favored a more Republican-style government. This all caused colonists to believe in the superiority of Republican forms of government and natural rights of citizens. This is best illustrated in a book by Thomas Paine named Common Sense, where he directly petitioned colonists to declare independence from Britain, and also arguing that a republican government based on the consent of the people was the best form of government, and that the British monarchy was tyrannical and harmful to the colony's interests. And I want you to think about this for a second. By calling it common sense, Paine made radical ideas like declaring independence and rejecting monarchy seem obvious and reasonable to everyday colonists. All of this Enlightenment thought, including this book by Paine, would be engraved in the ideas of the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. These philosophical causes, combined with British taxation, set the stage for the revolution. So the stage is set. Britain has levied many taxes on the colonies, and the colonists, inspired by Enlightenment thought, are reasonably mad. In response to the Intolerable Acts of 1774, the colonists convened at the First Continental Congress to try and solve the issue. However, then militiamen engage with British troops in the town of Lexington, and once those British troops marched to the town of Concord, even more militiamen fired upon them, forcing them to retreat under constant guerrilla-style attacks on their march back to Boston. The revolution had begun, and understand that the colonies didn't have an organized army. At the Second Continental Congress, colonists attempted to fix this by establishing the Continental Army. However, this army headed by George Washington was filled with militiamen who had no formal military training. England had been established for thousands of years and had an organized military and financial advantages. Because of this, the first part of this revolution saw the British winning most every battle. Bunker Hill, Quebec, Long Island, Fort Washington. All of these battles saw the British winning, but showed that colonists could put up a fight. This especially is shown in the Battle of Trenton, where Washington's surprise attack after crossing the Delaware River saw the colonists win. It was also around this time that Thomas Paine published Common Sense, and later America would declare their independence. The fact is, throughout all of these early engagements, colonists' morale was boosted and forces kept growing in the colonies, which caused colonists to win more battles. This all culminated in the turning point of the revolution being the Saratoga Campaign. Throughout the entire early part of this revolution, leaders like Ben Franklin had tried to get the French to join the revolution on the colonist side. When the colonies won the Battle of Saratoga, this finally convinced the French to join the revolution. Now we start seeing the colonists along with the now French victories in this revolution. Stony Point, Newton, Kings Mountain, Chesapeake, all leading to one decisive battle in the town of Yorktown, where rough fighting for over 3 weeks with a joint American and French siege that trapped the British caused the colonists to win. And finally, in 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the revolution was over, with the British finally recognizing America's independence. And anyone can argue the true reason America won. However, looking at the troop numbers from the beginning of this revolution to the end, the one thing to take away is that it was the colonists' ideological commitment, resilience, and assistance sent by European allies that truly caused America to come out on top. So the revolution is over. The question is, what effect did it have on society? Well, one of the things often glossed over about the revolution is that there were calls for abolition of slavery, hence garnering the name abolition movements. The reason for this was because of increased awareness of inequalities in society, and of course the Enlightenment, which caused people like Anthony Benezet before and through the revolution to continue writing books calling for the abolition of slavery. It did end up working, but only in little states like Pennsylvania, where they passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery, which gradually got rid of slavery in Pennsylvania. This was the first act of its kind and set a precedent for future abolitionist movements. There were also many other abolition movements in other northern territories like Massachusetts. Women played crucial roles in the revolution, often working as nurses, seamstresses, and managing households in their husband's absence. This increased participation, along with Enlightenment-inspired feminism orchestrated by Enlightenment thinker Mary Wollstonecraft, caused women to call for more expanded roles in society. Abigail Adams, in a letter to John Adams, pleaded for him to remember the ladies, and Judith Murray, in her On the Equality of the Sexes, used theology and reason to explain the equality of men and women. This would lead to a growing idea of Republican motherhood, which called on women to teach Republican values within the family and granted women a new importance in American political culture. However, women wouldn't start getting true rights until the first wave feminism of the mid-19th century. And last thing to note is the American Revolution's effect on the rest of the world. Debt caused by the American Revolution, along with many other reasons, caused France to go through a radical, bloody revolution. Haiti, being inspired by the American Revolution and a lot of other reasons, caused a slave rebellion in which they won. And once again, the influence of the American Revolution was a factor in causing a series of revolutions throughout Latin America. And though each of these revolutions had their own modicum of reasons for breaking out, the fact is, the American Revolution and its influence is a reason for each one. So I'm sure you were wondering how the colonies are governing themselves after this revolution. Well, first, states throughout the Americas around the end of the revolution started implementing their own state constitutions, which typically placed power in a legislative branch and kept that only people who owned property could vote. However, these constitutions showed America was not unified, and rather a bunch of separate states. Something called the Articles of Confederation were implemented at the Second Continental Congress, however states didn't really recognize it. In 1781, by the end of the Revolution, over a ratification process of 4 years, the Articles of Confederation finally came into power. The Articles created a central government for handling common concerns of the states, like diplomacy, defense, and managing Western territories. However, it was internally weak to avoid the kind of centralized authority that the colonies had rebelled against. The federal government created by the Articles could not enforce laws directly on the states or citizens. It had no power to tax and was largely dependent on state cooperation. Despite its weaknesses, the Articles did achieve successes, such as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which set up a framework for westward expansion. It established guidelines for admitting new states, promoted public education, protected private property, and banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. But anyone could see that there was a glaring issue with these articles, and this would lead to our next topic on the Constitutional Convention. Federalism, an idea that combines a general government with regional governments in a single political system. The Articles of Confederation was the original attempt at being a federalist document. The issue is that it didn't maintain a balance between states and the federal government and gave states too much power, and this ended up making the documents being weak. State representatives all knew this and decided to meet in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, where they would, through negotiation, collaboration, and compromise, draft a new form of government, being the Constitution, which made a more central government. The actual details of the Constitution will be covered next topic. For now, let's talk about this convention. The idea of federalism changed as a result of this convention. The way it changed was articulated in a document known as the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton and Madison, arguing a strong central government was necessary to create a perfect union and to protect the individual liberties of the people. So basically it was condemning the articles that did not achieve this central government. Then a new group would pop up opposing this imposition of the new Constitution, known as the Anti-Federalists. People in this Anti-Federalist group like Patrick Henry and George Mason argued that the Constitution didn't address states and individual rights enough. Because of this, to ensure the Constitution would be ratified, Federalists promised the addition of the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the United States. They emphasized individual rights and explicitly restricted the powers of the federal government to appease the Anti-Federalist groups. The best way to describe the Constitution is Ben Franklin's speech at the convention, where he said he didn't approve of parts of the Constitution, but acknowledged that a perfect document would be impossible, and this was likely the best thing that could be made. However, there was always one big issue, and from now until 1865, slavery will be that issue. The Constitutional Convention compromised on slavery by doing two things. First, they would pledge that Congress could not prohibit the international slave trade until 1808. Second, they made it so enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person when calculating a state's population for representation in Congress. Hence, it was known as the 3/5 Compromise. But understand that even though slavery was such a glaring issue, know that the word slavery was actually never mentioned in the Constitution. And that's all today. The Constitutional Convention, though originally happened to change the articles, caused a new document to come out of it explaining a new way of government that is still used to this day. It created a central government that the articles lacked, but also allowed the powers to be limited to embody federalism. There was still an issue though. People from states with a low population wanted an equal share in voting rights in the country, and people in states with higher populations wanted more voting rights because they had more people. This is where we see the great compromise of having the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate based on equal voting rights to each state. This constitution saw the implementation of three branches of government that are all supposed to have equal levels of power with the ability to check the power of each other branch, with the judicial housing the Supreme Court, the executive housing the president, and the legislative branch housing the House and the Senate. And through a lot of different ways explained in AP Government, each branch has its own specific ways of checking powers of the other branches to make sure one branch doesn't get too powerful. And in this way, we see the Constitution embodying the idea of federalism very well. So the Constitution is implemented and Washington becomes America's first president, shortly followed by John Adams. During their presidencies, foundational institutions were created to implement the Constitution, such as the establishment of the Executive Cabinet and the Judiciary Act of 1789, which would establish the federal court system, giving the judicial branch actual power. Specifically, Washington set important precedents, including serving only 2 terms and establishing a tradition of civilian leadership over the military. In the early years of the Republic, political leaders debated key issues like the balance of power between state and federal governments, economic policy such as the creation of a national bank, and the proper approach to foreign policy. These debates led to the formation of the first 2 political parties in the United States, the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, favoring a strong central government and pro-British foreign policy, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, advocating for states' rights and pro-French policies. These parties would cause separation that we even still see today. Washington warned against this in his 1796 farewell address, where he warned the nation against political factions, fearing they would divide the country. He also advised against becoming entangled in permanent foreign alliances, promoting a policy of neutrality that shaped U.S. foreign policy for years to come. After the American Revolution, the U.S. government had to navigate the continued presence of British and Spanish forces in North America. Britain specifically was participating in an act known as impressment, where the British Royal Navy forcibly seized men and forced them into naval service. So once the Napoleonic Wars broke out in Europe between Britain and France, the U.S. had to maintain neutrality, which was difficult due to issues like British impressment on American sailors and French demands for U.S. support under the Franco-American American alliance with the Federalists favoring Britain and the Democratic Republicans supporting France. Despite all of this, the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 passed by Washington officially declared neutrality. Over back in America, Spain expanded its influence by establishing mission settlements in California, relying on the labor of local Native American tribes. This would allow a cultural exchange around the California area at the expense of Native Americans. As American settlers moved westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, they sought access to key resources like the Mississippi River for trade. The U.S. negotiated treaties like Pinckney's Treaty in 1795, which granted Americans free navigation of the Mississippi to secure territorial and commercial interests. America was developing itself in its early years, but expansion westward would cause so much conflicts leading up to a certain war in 1861. But I get ahead of myself. Now we're going to move to talking about society and culture in the early society of the Americas. In the years following the American Revolution, a new national identity began to form. Americans, now free from British rule, wanted to define what made them unique. In literature, we see the work of people like Charles Brockden Brown, whose Wyland became one of the first American Gothic novels, focusing on uniquely American fears and experiences. The same search for identity appears in Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer, where he famously calls Americans a new man, different from Europeans, blending many cultures into something distinctly American. This cultural shift wasn't just about words, it was visual too. Federal architecture is a great example of how Americans blended old European styles with a new democratic aesthetic. Take Garrard's Bank in Philadelphia, completed in 1797. The building represents strength and stability. Religion continued to play a key role, especially in regional identities. Inspired by the First Great Awakening and the revolutionary ideas of liberty, figures like Gowan Pamphlet, the first known Black Baptist preacher, founded the First Baptist Church in Williamsburg, Virginia. His messages of equality showed the ongoing struggle for freedom and opportunity for all Americans. Science and philosophy also left their mark. The 1789 portrait of Franklin by Charles Wilson Peale highlights his status as a philosopher and a scientist, depicting him with a lightning rod, a symbol for his contributions to understanding electricity. John Trumbull's portrait of Washington and William Lee showed how painters crafted a visual narrative celebrating the American Revolution. These cultural developments reflect the growing sense of national identity in America, even as regional differences remained strong. The country's culture was evolving, from its art and literature to its religion and architecture. I said two things within my past videos. First, I said slavery will be the big issue until 1865. And second, I said westward expansion would cause the Civil War. In this period around 1800, we start seeing the start of this. Migrants continuously moved west, searching for a new life. The issue of this is that these migrants were encroaching on Native American land. This made Native Americans rethink their alliance with the US and start something known as the Northwest Indian War, and rebel, with some examples being St. Clair's defeat in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Even the federal government had attempted to test its federal power in this frontier tension, imposing a violent whiskey tax and prompting a rebellion against it. In the expansion westward, Britain took the side of Native Americans and provided support against the US, which would heighten tensions between the US and Britain, which would eventually cause another war to break out. The other thing to mention is the growing split between the North and the South. We start seeing these two areas separate on values around this time. The main reason for this was slavery. The South had slavery implemented heavily throughout its territories, and once they expanded westward, more slavery was implemented. This caused various anti-slavery sentiments to arise, such as Gabriel's Rebellion, where Virginia slaves rebelled and it ended in a violent suppression. Another example of this was the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery mentioned in previous videos. But overall, even with the split starting to emerge between the North and the South, lots of historians argue that this point in history was when Americans were most unified. On the screen.
Topic 4.2 is about the age of Jefferson's term in office and really what just happened. So, Thomas Jefferson, a die-hard Democratic Republican, takes office after the Federalist rule of Adams. Continuing into this period, we have these two parties debating over relations with the French and the British and powers of the federal government. All things covered in my Topic 3.10 video. But we start seeing debates over something new around this period known as tariffs, which is a tax on imported goods, meaning goods coming into America. This tax is paid by American companies, which typically raise their prices to accommodate for the tax. Understand that in a world where the South is typically known as a rural agrarian expanse known for farming, and the North is known for their industries and manufacturers, the South would be negatively affected by these tariffs as they need to import lots of goods because of the lack of industries they have. The North would benefit from this tax as Americans would start only buying American manufactured goods. The Democratic Republicans hated the idea of tariffs, aligning themselves with the South. The Federalists liked the ideas of tariffs, aligning themselves with the Northern view. During Jefferson's presidency, he enacted the trade embargo of 1807, which made it so America would stop importing British Britain's goods. This would end up backfiring and hurting the American economy. But possibly the most famous part of Jefferson's presidency was the case Marbury v. Madison, which was a Supreme Court case that established the concept of judicial review, which allowed the Supreme Court to review and invalidate actions taken by the other branches of government if they are deemed unconstitutional. And another popular thing is even more westward expansion. The US wanted the land of New Orleans and negotiated with France to get it. France offered the entire Louisiana territory as they were facing financial issues because of Napoleon, and the US bought it for $15 million. Now with all this territory, the US wanted to map it, so they sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition with the Native American guide of Sacagawea to help them. They went all the way from St. Louis to the Pacific and mapped out the western territories and realized, truly, how big it was. Topic 4.3 starts talking about tensions in the US economy and differing viewpoints. Some war broke out between Britain and the US in 1812 caused by British supporting Native American tribes and impressment on American sailors. It ended in a draw with the Treaty of Ghent that the US saw as a win, mostly because of the nationalism caused by the Battle of New Orleans. During this war, Federalists met at the Hartford Convention discussing disapproval of the war and potential secession. After America quote-unquote won this war, this convention would lead to the party's demise. And that leads into the introduction of a man who lots of people don't like, including me, Henry Clay. This guy was a lawyer, Secretary of State, leader of a future political party, and so influential in this period. He introduced something known as the American system. This was a response to the War of 1812 and suggested to provide national economic growth by establishing a protective tariff, creating a national bank, and funding internal improvements like roads and canals. This was so controversial and caused many debates to arise from the Democratic Republicans, later known as the Democrats, who opposed it, and the New National Republicans, later known as the Whigs, who supported it. The Supreme Court had its say with its McCulloch v. Maryland case, which established that federal power trumps state power. But who cares about that? It's time to talk about early Civil War causes. So throughout the early republic, states kept getting added and became either a slave or free state. As this continued, in 1819 there was a balance of 11 slave states and 11 free states. But as America was expanding westward, Missouri was added as a state. The South wanted it to be a slave state, and it ended up becoming one. The North, however, felt cheated and made the Missouri Compromise, which added Maine as an official free state and said above a certain line there couldn't be any more slave states. This shows the start of weak compromises, creating tension upon tension until eventual war. And how about even more Civil War causes? The Protective Tariff of 1828 put a tax on imported goods, and the South was very mad at it, even to the point they called it the Tariff of Abominations. This led to the South Carolina Exposition and the Nullification Crisis, where the South openly protested the tariff. There likely would have been war if it wasn't for Calhoun and Clay, who proposed the Tariff of 1833, which would lower the tax over the years. But what this shows is the South can and will revolt if it doesn't like something, foreshadowing the eventual Civil War. Topic 4.4 is about America's relations with other countries throughout the beginning of the 19th century. So it's fair to say America was struggling in this time to create a global presence. Turns out, inciting a revolution to create a nation doesn't get respect from other nations that have been on the globe for much longer. The US tried to rectify this through things like the War of 1812, but they needed more land. What they did first was acquire Florida from Spain in 1819 under these two treaties, and they also started a war where they forced the Seminole tribes out of the Florida lands. The US also decided to prove their naval might, which they did by inciting the Barbary Wars against North African states. But the big thing to talk about is, as America kept spreading westward, there was more and more conflict with Native Americans. Britain saw this as an opportunity to support the Native Americans against the Americans. This would cause President James Monroe to pass the Monroe Doctrine, which declared to Britain that any involvement in America by European powers would be seen as an act of war. And to add insult to injury, America also passed Macon's Bill No. 2, which prohibited French and British warships from entering American harbors. Topic 4.5 introduces the Market Revolution. The time of which great innovation in mechanization, agriculture, and commerce occurred is largely called and known as the Market Revolution, which is just a little part of the larger industrial evolution of the world. Inventions like the textile machinery, steam engines, interchangeable parts, the telegraph, and agricultural inventions made production methods of different products so much faster and easier, causing entrepreneurs to make a lot of goods and businesses, causing people to buy more goods, and you get the idea. One thing to note about the Market Revolution is the difference in evolution between the North and the South. The North became a place for all industries, housing all types of manufacturing and businesses. The advent of the cotton gin caused the South to farm cotton furiously, making the South grow up making mostly farms, having slaves work at them, and selling the cotton from those farms for massive amounts of money. Now, of course, the South needed to sell these goods to other countries mostly, but different
different legislation and judicial systems' support of development of roads and canals and railroads caused American regional markets and selling to grow. This would link the North and the South heavily, but it should still be noted that no matter how much the North and South are connected in this time period before the Civil War, these areas were different on values and culture and could not coexist peacefully with one another. The market revolution would also have a massive impact on society and culture as well, but that is a next video. Topic 4.6 introduces the societal and cultural impacts of the market revolution. The innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce we talked about last time didn't just make goods and businesses. They changed how people lived, worked, and thought about themselves. Large numbers of international migrants flooded into industrializing northern cities to find factory work. An example of a city growing heavily industrialized from this being Philadelphia. At the same time, a lot of Americans moved west of the Appalachians, building new communities along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with some cities growing here like St. Louis and Cincinnati. This movement created a new dynamic between regions as the North urbanized while the West focused on agriculture. Next, let's talk about wealth and class. Manufacturing growth led to higher standards of living for some folks, creating a bigger middle class and a wealthy business elite. But it should be noted, it also created a large and growing population of laboring poor who worked for long hours for low wages in these factories. Life was better for some, but definitely not for all. As for gender and family roles, with the rise of factories, many Americans, both men and women, stopped relying on farming to survive. Instead, they worked to produce goods for distant markets. This shift brought about new ideas of gender roles. Women especially were expected to stay home and embrace domestic ideals, which emphasized the separation of public work life for men and private home life for women. Not everybody was happy about this.
Hey there, Future Max here again. I just want to quickly note that for like the next 7 topics or roughly 10 minutes, I was actually pretty sick while I recorded those videos. The videos are pretty good. Just know if I sound a little bit different, that is why.
Topic 4.7 talks about expanding democracy from 1800 to 1848. Democracy in America went from being exclusive to rich, landowning white men to slightly less exclusive. By the 1840s, almost all adult white men could vote. So is that progress? Kind of. The big shift came with the elimination of property requirements for voting. Before this, you had to own land to cast a ballot, but as more states dropped this rule, voting rights expanded, and participatory democracy became a thing. One key event you should know is the Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island, where Thomas Dorr and his supporters pushed for a new state constitution to expand voting rights, since the original charter only let landowners vote. Basically, more people got involved in politics. However, it's important to note this only applied to white men. Women, Black Americans, and indigenous people were still left out. Now, with more people voting, political parties formed. The actual details of these political parties will be covered next video. But for now, all you should know is that the whole political framework of the 1820s up to the Civil War was known as the second party system. Oh boy, Andrew Jackson. We already get to talk about such an amazing man. And before I get canceled on Twitter, I'd like to say that I'm using a rare attribute called sarcasm. So new political parties emerged in the 1820s and 1830s. On one side, you had the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson, who believed in a limited federal government. Jackson was all about the common man, opposing elites and big government institutions. He famously hated the National Bank, calling it a corrupt tool of the wealthy. He vetoed its recharter in 1832 and moved federal funds to state banks, known as pet banks. On the other side, you had the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, who supported a stronger federal government. Remember that American system we talked about before? Well, the Whigs loved it. The thing is, the American system embodied every single thing Andrew Jackson despised. The debates in the American system weren't just political, they shaped the economy, infrastructure, and the direction of the country. As expansion roared heavily on the frontier, Jackson backed the frontier settlers with policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced Native American tribes off of their land. This led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were forcibly relocated to what is now Oklahoma, suffering greatly along the way. Jackson's policies made him a hero to many frontier settlers, but his use of federal power sparked fierce debates about whether the government was protecting citizens or abusing its power, especially when it came to native lands and the economy. Topic 4.9 talks about the development of a new American culture. Between 1800 and 1848, America wasn't just growing politically or economically, it was developing its own national identity. This new national culture combined American, European, and regional influences. In art, you had movements like the Hudson River School, which painted breathtaking landscapes of the American frontier. It wasn't just for art's sake, it symbolized manifest destiny and the idea that American natural beauty was something special. Meanwhile, writers like Washington Irving gave us stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, blending European storytelling traditions with with American settings and themes. But it wasn't all spooky stories and pretty paintings. Philosophy was evolving too. Case in point, Transcendentalism, a movement led by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They believed in individualism, nature, and the idea that humans could achieve personal perfection. Sounds inspiring, right? But it also had a political edge. Transcendentalists were big on social reform, especially abolitionism and women's rights. On the darker side of American culture, Gothic literature was making its mark. The big person here is Edgar Allan Poe with stories like The Telltale Heart, which is literally a story describing in vivid detail killing an old man, dismembering the body in a bathtub, and stuffing the body parts under a floorboard. I mean, hats off to this man. Finally, architecture played a key role in shaping the national identity. Buildings in Washington, D.C. like the White House and the Capitol were designed with neoclassical architecture inspired by ancient Greece and Rome. This is because America wanted to position itself as a modern republic with deep roots in democratic ideals. So the Second Great Awakening, what is it? Short answer, it was a religious revival. But more than that, it was a massive cultural shift that reshaped American society and politics. So you might be wondering, what caused the Second Great Awakening? Well, a few things. First was the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs. Second was a response to rationalism because of criticism of the Enlightenment being too rational-based. And let's not forget the market revolution, which uprooted communities and made people more mobile, creating new opportunities for religious movements to spread. Here's some examples of parts of this movement. Camp meetings became huge social events, especially on the frontier. Preachers like Charles G. Finley led emotional, fiery revivals in places like the burned-over district of New York, where religious enthusiasm ran so high it was said that there was no one left to convert. The Second Great Awakening also sparked major reform movements. Religious leaders preached that individuals could achieve personal salvation and improve society. This inspired people to tackle issues like abolitionism, temperance, and women's rights. Jarena Lee and Harry Hosier? We'll go with Hosier. Two prominent African-American preachers challenged traditional ideas by showing that Black Americans and women could lead in spiritual life. And one more thing, new religious movements emerged. Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, while William Miller's predictions about the end of the world led to the formation of the Adventist churches. So between 1800 and 1848, America experienced a wave of reform movements that aimed to fix society's problems and expand rights and opportunities. First, let's talk about what sparked these movements. The Second Great Awakening played a huge role. It wasn't just a religious revival, it encouraged people to believe that individuals could improve themselves and society. This, combined with a market revolution and greater mobility, made people more interested in reforming moral and social issues. So let's look at some reform movements. First up, abolition. The abolitionist movement grew in the North, calling for the immediate end of slavery. Leaders like William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, demanding freedom for enslaved people. Meanwhile, free African Americans like Frederick Douglass became powerful voices in the movement, sharing first-hand accounts of slavery's horrors. Then there was women's rights. In 1848, reformers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention, where they called for the greater equality of women. They even issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which borrowed language from the Declaration of Independence to demand women's rights to vote. This caused this time period to be dubbed the era of first-wave feminism. The temperance movement aimed to reduce alcohol consumption. Reformers believed drinking led to poverty, crime, and broken families. And of course, you know that there's no way that's true. Organizers like the Daughters of Temperance pushed for laws to limit or ban alcohol. Finally, utopian communities popped up around the country. Groups like the Shakers and Brook Farm tried to create perfect societies by rejecting traditional norms and focusing on communal living. But if there's one thing this course should teach you, it is that life is suffering, and of course all of these communities failed. So in this time period, African Americans, both enslaved and free, faced enormous challenges. But they also created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and fight for freedom. So what stayed the same and what changed? In the South, enslaved people continued to resist their oppression, but their efforts to end slavery were largely limited to rebellions, and most were unsuccessful. One of the most famous was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a violent uprising in Virginia that resulted in the deaths of over 50 people. The rebellion terrified Southern whites and led to harsher slave laws. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionist movements were growing. The free African American population increased, especially in cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Many African Americans founded their own communities and institutions to preserve their culture and fight for their rights. For example, the African Meeting House in Boston, built in 1806, became a hub for education, abolitionist meetings, and religious services. One key thing African Americans did was use the press. In 1827, Freedom's Journal became the first Black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. It gave African Americans a platform to speak out against slavery and challenge racist policies. But you have to understand, the biggest thing that helped these African Americans was their own spiritual commitment. Like, for example, enslaved people in New Orleans
Americans gathered at Congo Square on Sundays to play music, dance, and preserve their cultural traditions. These gatherings helped them maintain a sense of identity and community, even in the face of oppression. So here's the line to take away from this whole video. While African Americans faced harsh conditions of discrimination, they found ways to resist and fight for their freedom. America, a beautiful country of glorious cities, but there's really only one place you can call perfect. That's right, the American South. So what was the South like in this time period? Well, first off, geography and the environment shaped the South's economy and identity. Southern land was perfect for growing cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar, but there was also a problem: overcultivation. The soil in the Southeast became depleted, so slaveholders moved west, expanding plantations into new fertile land in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. Alright, enough beating around the bush. So slavery. Although most Southerners didn't own enslaved people, the region's economy and leadership were built on slavery. Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun went from calling slavery a necessary evil to defending it as a positive good. According to Calhoun, slavery wasn't just acceptable, it was essential to the Southern way of life. This focus on agriculture and slavery gave the South a distinct regional identity. While the North industrialized and diversified, the South stayed locked in traditional agriculture staples and resisted change. Southern business leaders kept relying on cotton exports to drive their economy, which made the South heavily dependent on both slavery and foreign trade. So what to take away from this is the South became its kind of own place and culture during this time period, and this tension with the North would, wait, say it with me, cause a future war. Alright, it is the 1840s and Americans are looking west. This idea that Americans deserve and are destined to expand across the entire continent, that is something known and called manifest destiny, and it was very popular in this time period. So the big question is why? Why did Americans think they were destined to expand? Well, simply because land equaled opportunity. The West had resources, open land, and the chance to get rich. Farmers saw fertile soil, miners chased gold, and religious groups like the Mormons just wanted to be left alone in Utah. And if you want a city to blame on that, you can look at Salt Lake City. So people just started packing up and heading west. And when I say heading west, I mean thousands of settlers risking their lives on trails like the Oregon Trail. Imagine walking 2,000 miles, losing half of your wagon, fighting off dysentery, and all you get in the end is a nice view. But hey, for many, it was actually worth it. And that leads to the one image that will always forever be used to define manifest destiny. I mean, look at that angel. It's as if these people were meant to expand west. Or at least that's what they thought at the time. And the funny part is, the government wanted in on the expansion too. To help settlers, they passed the Homestead Act, basically handing out free land, that is, if you could survive on it, and the Pacific Railroad Act, which helped build railroads across the country. This made it way easier to move west, but the US wasn't just looking west, they were looking transnational. Americans wanted more trade with Asia, and in classic US fashion, they weren't exactly subtle about it. The Treaty of, I'm not even gonna try and pronounce that, opened up trade with China, and the Treaty of Kanagawa forced Japan to open its ports to American ships. I know I've said a million times that expansion westward would cause the Civil War, but before the Civil War, it will actually cause a revolution and another war. But that is a next video problem. So it's 1845 and James K. Polk is elected president. If there's one thing you should know about this guy, it is that he cared only about one thing: westward expansion. He started by negotiating with Britain to secure Oregon up to the 49th parallel. This would avoid war while expanding the US northwest. But here's the thing, as America expanded, tensions with Mexico escalated over the Texas border. The US claimed the Rio Grande, while Mexico insisted it was the New Cass River. Polk sent troops into the disputed Texas-Mexico border, and after a skirmish, he claimed, quote, American blood was shed on American soil. He used this as a justification to declare war in what was known as the Mexican-American War. After the US captures some major cities and blockades Mexico, which cripples its economy, they end up winning the war. This war would end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And while this treaty did a lot of things, what you should know is that it gave the US a lot of land. Like, a lot of land. This land was known as the Mexican Cession, and the issue of whether each state would be slave or free would need to be solved further at something known as the Compromise of 1850. It should also be noted that US interaction and conflict with American Indians and Mexican Americans would increase because of the westward expansion. These often resulted in many unfair treaties, or in the case of Sand Creek, it would lead to a bloody massacre, where hundreds were said to have been slaughtered in 1864. War. So, the Mexican-American War just ended, and the US gained a massive chunk of land. This land was known as the Mexican Cession. But here's the issue. Should slavery be allowed in this new land or not? The North proclaimed no. The South, however, said yes. So yeah, we have another political crisis. There was an attempt to settle this issue early with something called the Wilmot Proviso. This was a proposal to ban slavery in all land gained from Mexico. It passed in the House where the North had more representation, but failed in the Senate where the South had enough power to block it. This failure only made sectional tensions worse, pushing the country closer to conflict. So what would attempt to solve this issue would be the Compromise of 1850. But it was, in many ways, a messy last-ditch attempt to keep the country from falling apart. The guy behind it, you guessed it, Henry Clay. This compromise had 5 parts, and they all tried to balance free and slave state interests. First was California would become a free state. Second is that Utah and New Mexico territories got to decide on slavery themselves through voting. Third is that the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. Fourth was a stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed, forcing Northerners to return escaped slaves. And 5, Texas got paid $10 million to give up some land claims. Yeah, I don't really understand that one either. The big part to know about this is the Fugitive Slave Act made Northerners furious. Even if they weren't abolitionists, they hated being forced to return enslaved people. This led to massive resistance, like the Underground Railroad working overtime, and northern states passing personal liberty laws to ignore the act altogether. Meanwhile, in the South, even though they got some wins from the compromise, they still weren't happy. They wanted an even bigger guarantee that slavery would expand. The failure of this compromise was easy to see, and this weak compromise is easily the biggest cause of the Civil War we have talked about thus far. So we already know from the entirety of Unit 4 that the North and South at this time were essentially 2 different countries, with the North being industry-based and the South being farming-reliant. So now, stuff is going to happen in Europe. A series of revolutions break out in Europe around 1848, and a potato famine breaks out in Ireland, which causes tons of immigrants from Ireland and Germany to flood into the US, mostly all settling in northern cities. They built ethnic communities to preserve their language and culture, but not everybody welcomed them. But what you should understand is truly how many immigrants that came into the US. I mean, look at this graph and its spike there. Need I even say more? Alright, enough about migration, let's look at some abolitionists. Even though abolitionists were a minority in the North, they made a lot of noise. As we've talked about before, Frederick Douglass gave fiery speeches, including What to the Slave is the 4th of July, exposing the hypocrisy of American freedom. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, exposing the horrors of slavery, a book that was said to be so influential that Lincoln supposedly said it started the Civil War. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad helped enslaved people escape to the North. The North and South weren't just disagreeing. They were on completely different planets at this point. Immigration, economic divide, and the fight over slavery kept deepening sectional conflict, making war almost inevitable. So it's truly time to examine the causes of the Civil War. At this point, every compromise about slavery has flopped. The Missouri Compromise? Gone. The Compromise of 1850 made things worse. So now let's look at the final attempts to hold this broken country together, and how they spectacularly failed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act got passed, which allowed those states to freely vote on whether they wanted to allow slavery or not. And the funny part, that whole Missouri Compromise line from earlier, it didn't matter anymore, because Nebraska was well above that line. But what you should know about this act is it caused thousands to pour into these states to vote for their own side, which led to what is called Bleeding Kansas, where everyone fought in the streets and killed each other over votes in Kansas. One of the people famous here was an absolutely insane man named John Brown, who was against slavery and staged a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, before being killed by the expertise of Robert E. Lee. The chaos of Bleeding Kansas and the spread of slavery enraged anti-slavery Northerners, leading to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854. But now that we have all this, let's contextualize and envision the world right now. We know from the Constitution that the US needs 3 branches of government to function, so let's look at each of them right now. First, the executive. Leading up to the Civil War, we see a collection of weak presidents that did nothing truly notable to address the issue of slavery. Okay, so the executive branch is a no-go, but let's try the legislative. Well, here in the Senate, Charles Sumner gave a speech against slavery, which caused a Southern congressman named Preston Brooks to beat him within an inch of his life with a cane. Okay, so the legislative is a bust, but as long as we have the Supreme Court, Dred Scott v. Sanford. God damn it. This case established that slaves were not citizens and Congress could not ban slavery in Southern territories. So we have the executive branch being weak. We have people caning each other on the Senate floor and the legislative, and deplorable, sadistic rulings by the Supreme Court. When you look at it this way, it honestly is hard to think a war couldn't have broken out. And I'll end this video with a quote from the most sane, reasonable, level-headed guy I can think of, John Brown. Right before he died, he said, quote, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And guess what? He was right, because the Civil War started less than 2 years later. The stage is set. America is on the brink of collapse. The North and the South are done with compromises. Sectional tensions are at an all-time high, and now there's a presidential election that's about to decide the fate of the entire nation. America was so divided at this point that 4 different candidates ran for president. First, we have Abraham Lincoln for the Republican Party. He was against slavery spreading westward, but not planning to abolish it in the South. Next, you have Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat. His idea was to leave decisions in the hand of the people to vote for. Then we had John C. Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democrat. He was very pro-slavery, wanting it everywhere. And finally, we have John Bell with the Constitutional Union Party, who pleaded for the Constitution. Who cares? But the real issue, Lincoln's Republican Party was based entirely in the North, and he wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. But guess what? It didn't even matter. He won anyway. The moment Lincoln won, the South absolutely lost its mind. They saw it as the beginning of the end for slavery. South Carolina didn't wait around. It seceded just weeks after the election. By early 1861, 6 more states followed, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln ran on a campaign that had at its forefront to keep the Union together. He promised not to invade the South unless it was necessary to fulfill that. In April, the Confederates decided to enact the final straw and fired at Fort Sumter, a U.S. military base in South Carolina. Lincoln called for troops to put down the rebellion, and just like that, Civil War had begun. So, Lincoln is elected, the South secedes, and war is officially started. But here's the issue. The Union and Confederacy were nowhere near evenly matched. The North had more people, more industry, more railroads, and the ability to outproduce and outlast the South. The only thing the South really had was better generals and a home field advantage. But don't discount this part. The South had a population that was willing to fight to the death. And that's where the term, a war of attrition, truly comes from. The first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, where the Confederacy bombarded a U.S. fort in South Carolina. Lincoln responded by calling for troops, and just like that, the war had begun. But let's be clear, the Union was not prepared. The first major battle at Bull Run ended with a humiliating Union defeat, proving this war wouldn't be over quickly. So now we see 2 different war strategies unfold. The Confederacy's plan was simple: hold out, play defense, and hope Europe intervenes. Meanwhile, the Union launched the Anaconda Plan, a strategy to blockade the South, control the Mississippi River, and squeeze the Confederacy into submission. The early war saw Confederate victories, mostly thanks to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson outmaneuvering Union forces. Battles like Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, what the heck are these cities, showed that the South had a real shot at winning. Meanwhile, both sides struggled on the home front. The New York City draft riots showed anti-war sentiment in the North, while the Richmond bread riots exposed the starvation and desperation of the South. But then comes the turning point, 1863. First, we have the Battle of Gettysburg, where Lee tried to go on the offensive but got absolutely pummeled in a 3-day bloodbath, forcing him to retreat. And around the same time, Ulysses S. Grant won the Battle of Vicksburg, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in half. So now the war completely shifts. Grant is promoted, and he brings in William Sherman, who introduces something known as total war. This guy truly was unbelievable. Sherman burned everything in his path through Georgia, destroying crops, railroads, and entire cities in his, quote, march to the sea. Meanwhile, Grant takes on Lee directly, hammering the Confederates with non-stop battles, knowing that the North could replace soldiers, but the South really couldn't. By 1865, the South was done. Lee surrendered at the courthouse, and just like that, the Civil War was over. In the end, 698,000 people died. This makes the Civil War the deadliest war in American history. And no, we are not counting World War I or II in that. We talked about all the military stuff of the Civil War. Now let's examine the political side. At first, Lincoln made it clear. This war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. But as the war dragged on, that changed. Let's talk about how. By 1862, Lincoln knew the war needed a new purpose. And after the Union's sort of victory at Antietam, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document freed enslaved people in Confederate-held territories, but not in border states. It reframed the war as a fight against slavery, not just Union preservation. And third, it kept Europe, especially Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. Now, even though it didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it was a game changer, because now thousands of formerly enslaved people escaped plantations and enlisted in the Union Army. By the end of this war, nearly 200,000 African Americans fought for the Union. The 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry Regiment and the 54th Massachusetts proved black soldiers were essential to the Union victory. After the bloodbath at Gettysburg, Lincoln gave a 2-minute speech that completely redefined the Civil War. In it, he said, number 1, the war was about preserving democracy and fulfilling the ideals of the Founding Fathers. And number 2, the Union must win, so government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. This speech solidified that America wasn't just fighting the South, it was fighting for its identity. But I want you to think beyond the political aspect for a second. For black Americans all around the country, this wasn't about some simple politics. This was about having the simple human right to live freely. This is about being able to be treated with just some dignity in their life. This war was about freedom, democracy, and most of all, national unity. So the Civil War is over. So many battles of attrition along with various scorched earth policies have caused the South to be in ruins, literally. Yes, the South had lost the war, but now they were a part of the Union again, so the government tried to usher in an era known as Reconstruction to rebuild the South. Originally during the war, Lincoln issued his 10% plan that told the South he would readmit a southern state to the Union and give it America's protection and benefit so long as 10% of the voters pledged loyalty to him. Lincoln's plan aimed to be lenient and avoid punishing the South, focusing on restoring the Union quickly. But then Lincoln had to go and die in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, which upset quite a bit. Andrew Johnson came in and gave his plan, which was very similar to Lincoln apart from offering pardons to former Confederates. Then later in Reconstruction, the radical Republican plan was put into effect as Republicans gained more power. This was meant to punish the South, protect black rights, and send the military to enforce it. The South absolutely hated this. And the thing is, Andrew Johnson hated radical Republicans and tried to veto everything. Congress responded by impeaching him, making him the first US president to almost be removed from office. Reconstruction also allowed some amendments to be passed as well. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th, which granted birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th, which gave black men the right to vote. But even though this seems like a good idea, you need to understand that this era was really no better for African Americans than before the Civil War. Almost immediately after the southern states were readmitted to the Union, they passed black codes, which were codes in the South that limited freedoms of African Americans and continuously forced African Americans into forced labor, despite slavery being technically over. Blacks worked the fields in a system known as sharecropping, where it wasn't technically slave labor, but with their wages, it might as well have been. There would be public events held in the South, where people would gather to watch African Americans be hanged, or tarred and feathered, or any number of ways to die, known as lynchings. And then you have organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, which used literal terrorism to suppress black voters. All of this would force the North to just give up entirely and cause Reconstruction to fail, but that is a next video. So Reconstruction was supposed to fix the South and bring equality for all African Americans, but instead, it completely failed. At first, things looked promising. Black men gained citizenship and voting rights. Over 2,000 African Americans held public office, and federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce Reconstruction policies. But white Southerners hated this, and they fought back hard. We already talked about some examples of this being sharecropping, lynchings, and organizations like the KKK, but you also had things like convict leasing, where black men were arrested for made-up crimes and forced into unpaid labor. Then came the Supreme Court, which basically gave up on protecting black rights. The slaughterhouse cases in 1873 gutted the 14th Amendment by saying civil rights were a state issue, not a federal one. In the US v. that, they said that the federal government couldn't punish white mobs that murdered black Americans. With no one left to enforce black rights, white Southerners took control again. And then came the final nail in the coffin, being the Compromise of 1877. Essentially, the 1876 presidential election was a mess, so Republicans and Democrats made a backroom deal. The North would remove troops from the South, and in return they would elect a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, as president. But this would mean Reconstruction would end, and the South could do whatever it wanted. So, that's exactly what happened. Black rights were crushed for nearly a century. Jim Crow laws, segregation, and voter suppression took over. Reconstruction was the US's first attempt at civil rights, and it failed miserably. But the 14th and 15th Amendments didn't go away. They became the legal foundation for the civil rights movement 100 years later. On the screen now And really quickly, as we are over halfway through this course, consider subscribing to this channel and potentially following my Instagram. Totally up to you though. Let's get into Unit 6.
Unit 6 is here, and we transition into a new time period of American history.
We covered antebellum, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, which are all viable eras of American history. Now we transition into a new era called the Gilded Age. This era will be explored throughout this unit, but the biggest thing to notice is that the US will slowly start becoming controlled by the rich throughout this era, not the government. Of course, there will be three big causes of this: westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism. Right now, we will simply talk about the westward expansion part of it. So let's recap. The Civil War and Reconstruction has ended. Yes, this has left devastation all around the country, but it also has left one other big thing: an unbelievable level of manufacturing. The big things here were factories, steel, and railroads. Railroads were especially exciting because they could move a lot of goods very fast, and the government made them cheap to build. And that is why the Transcontinental Railroad was ordered to be built from the east to the west. Why go to the west, you ask? It's simple: gold. So much gold was found in places like modern-day Colorado, California, Nevada, and many other places that many settlers saw as a chance to get rich. It also helped that at this time it was really easy to move west because the government still had the Homestead Act in place, along with various subsidies to incentivize expansion. Farmers got a bunch of new farming innovations like barbed wire and steam-powered equipment. And most importantly, the West offered new land to farm and mine on. With thousands of people moving west, many communities formed. I personally cannot be asked to go over them, but here are some if you really care to read about them. Now here's where things get muddy. Though there isn't a technical start of the Gilded Age, this is how the Gilded Age essentially starts. There's only one way a farmer or miner in the West is going to transport their goods back to the East: railroads. The owners of these railroads knew this and raised the prices on everyone, especially small businesses. This led to farmers creating groups and alliances, such as the Grange, the Farmers Alliance, and the Colored Farmers Alliance. But remember what I said earlier: the rich are in control in this time period. And so it's no surprise that all of these for the most part failed. In this time period, farmers relied on bank loans, and the influx of farming goods caused prices to drop, making it so farmers suffered quite a bit from debt. But remember, this video is only one of 3 separate causes of the Gilded Age. There are still others you have to consider. So we already know this. Settlers are moving west because of gold, opportunity, farming, blah blah blah. Now we are going to talk about the effects of this. So we already talked about the Transcontinental Railroad. What we didn't talk about was that the people building this railroad were mostly Chinese and Irish immigrants. And understand that this was no easy job. A very dangerous explosive called nitroglycerin was constantly used to blow out tunnels, and it would make it very dangerous to work on these railroads. Another thing to note is this animal right here. In 1860, there were an estimated 30 million bison in the United States. By 1884, there were less than 1,000. So how the heck did this happen? Well, railroads split the herds. Companies hired hunters to kill them for hides, and the US military encouraged killing them to force native tribes off the plains. But that isn't even talking about the worst part. Let's look at our standard US map. West. Well, what is west? Gold, obviously, right? No, I mean the people actually originally inhabiting the land. Yeah, Native Americans still exist, and they are still trying to live freely in the West. But by this point, Americans had so many incentives to move west that they didn't just ignore Native peoples, they actively despised them simply for living on the land. Treaties that once promised Native sovereignty were completely violated. America would switch to a reservation policy and force Native tribes to live on specific reservation lands. And this did not suit many Native cultures. So did the natives fight back? Of course they did. It started with Sand Creek, which was the first major show of federal betrayal. The Red River War ended Native resistance in Texas and Oklahoma. The Nez Perce War ended organized resistance in the Northwest. The Apache Wars dragged on for decades, but ended when the Geronimo surrendered in 1886. Now there were Native victories too, like the Sioux Wars and the Battle of Little Bighorn, but those wins were temporary. Everything all came crashing down with the Dawes Act in 1887. This divided Native land into private plots, giving the quote surplus to white settlers. This led to the loss of over 90 million acres of native land. And around the same time, a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance spread among tribes. It symbolized hope for a world without white domination. And of course, the US white-dominated military saw it as a threat, and it all culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre. This would kill 300 natives and end the so-called Indian Wars across America, the Indians being the obvious losers. If you can't tell, America America are not the good guys here. They took land they promised not to take and killed thousands in the process. In fact, if you live in any of these states, you are living on technical stolen land as we speak. It's unfortunately one of the darkest parts of American history. It's been a while since we've talked about them, so let's go check on our good old friends, the South. We've known up to this point that the South as an economy is essentially entirely based on agriculture. And up until the Civil War, that agriculture was essentially all done by slaves. So now, when the war and Reconstruction are over, a journalist named Henry Grady sees this and starts petitioning the South to modernize and adopt the industrial practices of the North and turn themselves into a quote, new South. Now this does gain attention. The North funds the South to build mills, mines, and factories, and big industrial cities form such as Charlotte and Atlanta. But even with all this industry getting introduced, this quote, new South will continue to rely on farming and sharecropping for its primary economic base. So on the surface, the new South is marked by a switch to industry, when in reality, agriculture still remains the primary economic driver. However, the other part to this is the role of African Americans. And this is where you see the big contradiction of the new South. Because while the South talked a big game about modernization and progress, socially and politically, it was still stuck in the past. White supremacy didn't disappear at all. And the clearest example of this is the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which ruled that racial segregation laws, known as Jim Crow laws, were constitutional as long as facilities were, quote, separate but equal. In practice, this whole separate but equal thing never actually worked out. African Americans constantly received worse facilities, fewer resources, and almost zero legal protection. Convict leasing, lynchings, poll taxes, and unfair literacy tests were all still very common across the South. Now, there were people who advocated for African American rights, such as Booker T. Washington, who emphasized economic self-help and education, and journalists like Ida B. Wells directly challenged lynchings and racial violence. But with these Jim Crow laws now being considered constitutional, it would be hard for any real civil rights to appear until quite a bit later. So, the Gilded Age. When I see this era of American history, what I think of is governmental corruption, big business, and disgustingly rich people having power over the government. All that stuff we will get to in our next topic. But for this topic, what we need to talk about is the sheer amount of industrialization that happened during the Gilded Age. You might remember the market revolution. In the early 1800s, you had people making machines. During the Gilded Age, you now have machines making machines. In the past, industry relied on iron. Now with the Bessemer process, steel is what takes over. In the market revolution, factories ran on steam. Now everything runs on electricity and it transforms production. And the other part of this is now with all this new railroad expansion, the US has access to so much land. And that land is a literal gold mine of resources such as coal, iron, oil, timber, copper, etc. But anyway, you see what's happening here. We have so many resources and a lot of new innovations. This will make large-scale businesses. These businesses will become extremely popular. The people owning these businesses will get really rich. The US will stand down and adopt a laissez-faire capitalist economic policy. And there you go. That's the Gilded Age coming to life. In a previous video, I said the three causes of the Gilded Age were westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism. We already covered the West, so now it's time to talk about the other two, starting with the Industrial Revolution. And when I say the Industrial Revolution, I mean the Second Industrial Revolution. And even though that's considered a more European term, with how much industrialization happened during the Gilded Age, it is fair to call what happened a Second Industrial Revolution. During the Gilded Age, all the new technology led to businesses wanting to capitalize on the production, or rather the mass production of the goods. There was a really big workforce because of a bunch of new immigration, and the government policies heavily favored businesses. And that is where we get to throw in a key term, industrial capitalism. This is where private individuals own the means of production, like factories and machinery, to generate profit through wage-based labor by mass-producing goods. Since this would be popularized, it would mean the capitalist laissez-faire economic system would become mostly standard in the United States, meaning that it is the third cause of the Gilded Age. Now we turn to the consequences of this industrial expansion, which facilitated the rise of three dominant corporate figures of the Gilded Age: John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. Rockefeller was probably the richest man in American history. He coined horizontal integration, where he'd buy out all of his rivals, and he led the oil industry. Carnegie, on the other hand, coined vertical integration, where he controlled each and every means of production and led the steel industry. And Morgan's the bank guy, meaning he controlled like finance or something. Stuff like trusts were set up, along with many companies holding stock in other companies known as holding companies, which resulted in entire industries like oil and steel to be completely monopolized. And these businesses would even seek out markets outside of America in all of these places on the screen, and this would be the economic prelude to American imperialism. As for the government, initially what we see are weak Supreme Court decisions and the poorly enforced Sherman Antitrust Act, which meant the government really couldn't do anything to combat this Gilded Age. And yes, it is definitely fair to say that these corporate giants used their deep pockets to influence American politics. So you might ask, what is the result of all of this? Well, I'll tell you. This would cause a disproportionate share of American wealth to be accumulated amongst a very few top elite. Small businesses now don't stand a chance. Monopolies would cause prices on goods to go up, and most of all, workers would be paid horribly in these factories and had almost no power to bargain otherwise. Very quickly, this will cause these quote captains of industry to be referred to as robber barons, because honestly, that is kind of what they are. This would lead to a movement later known as progressivism, but I get ahead of myself. So it's time to talk about the societal impact of the Gilded Age. And to put it into perspective, I will say 3 things that will be hard to believe. During the Gilded Age, prices on goods mostly went down. Workers' real wages actually increased, and most people's standard of living actually improved. So that sounds great, right? Wrong. Yes, mass production lowered prices, and yes, wages rose on paper, but that didn't mean workers lived well. Most industrial workers earned barely enough to survive, lived in overcrowded tenement housing, and worked brutal hours in unsafe factories. And cheaper goods don't matter much when your life is already miserable. Yeah, so why don't we play a fun game now? I imagine most of my audience consists of the typical teenage Target worker. So let's compare what labor is like for a modern day Target position compared to a Gilded Age factory position. Well, first, at Target you are only allowed to work 8 hours a day. I mean, it's standard, obviously. Now moving over to the Gilded Age, yikes. That's rough, buddy. But okay, at least Target has the ironclad rule of no child labor for anyone under the age of 16. Oh, but what's with all these photos during the Gilded Age of kids working? It's almost as if in the past, child labor was extremely common. But don't worry, at least at Target, you're not gonna get horribly injured, and if you do, you'll at least have workers' comp to pay for it. Well, here's the Gilded Age. That's right, there are no safety regulations, frequent injuries, child labor, no workers' comp, long hours, no breaks, no helmets, no guards, no warnings.
5 minutes later.
So you get the idea. Because of these horrid circumstances, some workers united together into unions that would protest this. Here are a few examples. The Knights of Labor was a union who accepted people of all skills, genders, and races. They argued for 8-hour workdays, no child labor, and equal pay. It's too bad that they were horribly unorganized, and they were also unfortunately blamed for this next thing, the Haymarket Affair. The story goes, workers were protesting against police violence against workers. One thing led to another, someone threw a bomb, and there you go, 11 people died. And finally, the Pullman Company's workers went on strike. The big deal with this one is that it showed complete obvious proof that the government would side with businesses over the common citizen. So yeah, early on, workers are still going to be under horrible conditions. But don't worry, there is a reason the next era is called the Progressive Era. So there is a big workforce in all of these factories. So you might wonder, who exactly comprises this workforce? Simply put, it's mostly immigrants. Like obviously, there are a lot of prim and proper Americans in the batch, but it was mostly immigrants. To basically oversimplify this, not just America, but the entire world is getting privy to the knowledge of all the jobs available in the United States. And a lot of people wanted to come over and start a new life. And also it helped that life in these immigrants' homelands were not really that great, especially if they were uniquely religious. The 2 big waves of immigration you'll see are people coming in from Europe to the East Coast, and those coming in from Asia on the West Coast. This will lead to the formation of 2 big hubs of immigrant processing: Ellis Island right outside of New York City, and Angel Island right outside of San Francisco. So let me quickly explain something. If you're an Uncle Sam American in this time period with your own twisted racial beliefs, on the Ellis Island side, of course you're gonna want the lovely, hardworking, mostly white Europeans in America, because they will create a better society. But those Asians on the Angel Island side, so yeah. What I mean is that, in this time period, Ellis Island was known as very welcoming, it even had health checks, and was seen as a mostly great place. Angel Island, on the other hand, was home to countless interrogations, detentions, and long stays, all instigated by deeply rooted anti-Asian racism. And though unrelated, here's a picture of me many years ago on Angel Island. happened. There's no real historical significance here. I honestly just wanted to show off that I've been there. Anyway, the outcome of all of this immigration is the formation of lots of ethnic enclaves. This era is the pure reason why there are things like Chinatowns, Little Italies, Jewish neighborhoods, and much more ethnic areas around the US. We also see a lot of internal migration in this time period as well. For example, you have lots of people from the rural countryside moving into urban cities. And finally, a bunch of African Americans are moving out of the South. Cause honestly, screw that goddamn place. This would set the stage for something later known as the Great Migration. I think it's fair to say that all the immigration coming into the United States during this Gilded Age was not that well received by American society. America has mostly always stood on the principle of the acceptance of any sort of immigration. At least, that's what they say on the surface. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of debates and quite a bit of governmental action as well, so let's give a few examples. First of all, do you remember all those Chinese immigrants that risked their lives to do dangerous work building the Transcontinental Railroad? Well, here's a fun story. There was so much anti-Asian racism that by 1882, America passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that put a 10-year ban on any new Chinese labor immigration. But you also have good things too. Like for example, in the Supreme Court case US versus Wong Kim Ark, it established and solidified birthright citizenship, meaning anyone born in the US is a US citizen. A good book to reference here might be Rose Cohan's Out of the Shadow. This book follows the tale of Rose, who immigrated into the US as a Jewish immigrant, and shows her struggles to maintain her culture as she worked through countless sweatshops. Another thing to note here is the work of women, or more specifically one woman named Jane Addams. She's known for doing quite a lot of stuff, but for this time period, what you should know is that she co-founded the famous Hull House, where she would aid the poor along with immigrants. Also during this time, you have people all over the place wanting to justify their class, race, or just status in society. And this is where an ideology takes hold known as social Darwinism. Essentially what this means is applying the quote survival of the fittest ideal to society. Or for a better definition, social Darwinism argues that the strong naturally dominate the weak and that social inequality, racism, and imperialism are justified as natural outcomes of competition. Now of course, I'm not even going to get into how this is completely wrong and how it completely misapplies Charles Darwin's original thinking. Rather, I just want you to know that this very controversial ideology was used in this time period to justify the success of those on top of the social ladder. I feel like throughout this entire unit, all I've done is talk about how the rich are living great and the poor are not. And yes, that is true, but there are quite a few people outside of the top and the bottom of the bottom that actually benefited from the Gilded Age. This group of people would be the new emerging middle class. Let me tell you why this middle class actually formed. Going back to this triangle, you have the ultra rich up at the top and the poverty-stricken factory workers at the bottom. But those weren't the only two jobs that were needed in this era. Big businesses like factories also require a lot of white-collar work, meaning things like managers, accountants, clerks, typists, secretaries, salespeople, etc. were needed. And these jobs paid better than factory work and were way safer. Most of the clerical work that was available at a lower level will actually mostly be taken by the women in society. The other thing this ties into is education. Lots of these jobs require a formal education to understand them, which is where the Morrill Act of 1862 comes in. This act gave federal land to states, and in exchange, the states would use the land to build institutions like colleges to teach all the skills needed for these white-collar jobs. This is where we start seeing teacher training or business education and a new importance to professional credentials. And also, since there's now actually a decent amount of people in the middle class with disposable income and leisure time, the first modern consumer culture develops. Things like amusement parks such as Coney Island, or maybe department stores, or a plethora of other things. Also, let's talk about the rich really quickly. Social Darwinism argued that inequality between the rich and the poor is natural, which mainly just gave poor people another reason to resent the wealthy. So specifically, one man, my boy Andrew Carnegie, saw this and decided to create a new ideology and called it his quote gospel of wealth. This book doesn't reject anything new. In fact, it openly accepts inequality, capitalism, and elite dominance as natural. What it does differently is add a moral responsibility. The big argument of this book is that the rich deserve their wealth, but they must use it wisely for the public good. And believe it or not, it for the most part actually works. This idea will cause contributions that create libraries, universities, museums, hospitals, and lots more urban improvements. So at least one person on our big three list is doing good for the world. Just one though. This video is not about the progressive era. It does kind of establish the roots to the later progressive movements, but we aren't quite there yet. The big idea with this topic is obviously with these horrible societal inequities, there are going to be lots of people beginning to push for reform. This will typically split into a lot of groups. We're going to talk about each of them. To start off, socialists and radical influential labor leaders like Eugene V. Debs argued that capitalism exploited workers and that major industries should be publicly owned. This group was linked to many strikes such as the Pullman one talked about in a previous video. Then you have the social gospel movement. People like Washington Gladden will argue for a religious response to poverty. They argued Christianity should address inequality, labor conditions, and urban poverty. And finally, you have the utopians, agrarians, and critics. These movements were less important individually and had similar arguments, which is why I'm lumping them all together. They pretty much all criticize monopolies, wage labor, and urban misery. Alright, moving on. Let's talk about women. We already talked about Jane Addams and her Hull House, but you have to understand. In this time period, women couldn't vote and had very limited legal power. So a response you'll see to this is the constant use of voluntary organizations to exert influence. Yes, you have the reformers, and yes, you have the organizations, but you see a common trend of what most women in these organizations were pushing for: temperance, child labor reform, public health, education, and anti-lynching activism. It's time to talk about some macroeconomic principles, meaning we're gonna switch over to my lovely economics background. Man, this background brings back so many memories of when I actually tried to review AP Economics on this channel. Gotta say, glad I didn't finish those courses. Anyway, let's talk about what the term laissez-faire means. When I plug it into Google Translate, it literally means in French, let it happen. And this actually perfectly explains the concept. If you are adopting a laissez-faire mentality, it means you are taking a hands-off approach. You don't intervene at all and let all problems get solved without any intervention. Moving back over to our history background, there were increasing debates over whether the government should be involved in regulating businesses and have a hand in their own economics. And I'm sure you can guess the result: the US will choose to adopt a laissez-faire mentality. However, you do see attempts to intervene like the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act, but those governmental actions will be poorly enforced. In fact, a good example to counter these points is President Grover Cleveland's veto to sending relief to farmers. This shows the US actively refusing to help their own economy in hardship. But here's your contradiction. Because while the US government didn't intervene at home, they definitely intervened around the world. The point is, the US wants more markets and more resources. Your two examples to memorize here is the US attaining the lovely Hawaii and Alaska. Hawaii was attained for access to the sugar industry, and Alaska was attained for its positioning and resources. There are also other examples, but you don't necessarily need to know them all. To close out this unit, we're gonna talk about politics. Throughout US history, we've gone through many political parties. For the Gilded Age, the US has settled on the Republicans and Democrats. Republicans were strongest in the North, were often backed by big businesses and industry, and supported high tariffs along with gold standard currency. Democrats were strongest in the South. They often drew support from farmers and immigrants, and they liked low tariffs, and they were more likely to support something like free silver as the currency system. The ironic part here is that these parties actually had a lot similar to one another. They both were pro-business, they both avoided major reform, they both still relied on Civil War loyalty for votes, and most of all, they both were horribly corrupt. Let's zoom in on the corruption. Something called political machines traded jobs and aid for votes, especially in immigrant neighborhoods. Now, they were corrupt, but they also filled a welfare gap the government ignored. A good example of this was Tammany Hall in New York City. The Pendleton Civil Service Act tried to fix this by creating merit-based federal jobs. But even with this, distrust in government still stayed high. And this is where some agrarian activists will form the People's Party, or rather better known as the populist movement. Pretty much this movement will argue that the government should protect ordinary people, not corporations. That means free silver, a graduated income tax, a regulation on railroads, and a lot more things will be argued for. A Democratic leader who championed key populist ideals is a man named William Jennings Bryan. He's best known for his famous Cross of Gold speech, where he argued that ordinary Americans shouldn't be, quote, crucified upon a cross of gold, condemning the gold standard and calling for free silver to expand the money supply. Now, this speech is a little complex to understand, but to simplify it, all he was really trying to do is expand money policies to try and help farmers and laborers, so basically the common citizen. Now, even though populists won't be elected for any presidential elections, you will see their ideas come up again in progressivism and the New Deal. To start off this unit, before progressivism in US history, there will be a very brief era of imperialism. Imperialism here will simply mean that the US will go out and try to take other land, and as a result become a world global power. We already talked about little examples like Hawaii, and we'll get to the big example next topic. For now, we need to talk about debates over imperialism, because you have the side of people who supported imperialism and the side who didn't. This will be all we cover this topic, so let's try to go through this debate as fast as we can. Imperialists, or those who support imperialism, will have mostly four arguments. 1. Economics, because imperializing will lead to new markets and resources. 2. Power politics, because Europe was colonizing and the US didn't want to fall behind. 3. Racism / a quote civilizing mission, because of the belief that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASPs, should quote uplift others. And finally 4. The frontier was closed. This idea was caused by the 1890 census, signaling westward expansion was basically over. Examples of people in this group are Alfred Thayer Mahan and Josiah Strong. Moving on to the anti-imperialists. They will have three arguments. 1. Self-determination, meaning the idea of being an empire contradicts US Republican ideals and the literal Declaration of Independence. 2 is racism, because people on this side didn't really want non-white people added to the US. And finally 3. Isolationism. They argued Americans should keep their focus at home and avoid overseas entanglements. A group to reference here might be the Anti-Imperialist League, and a few people to note might be Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain. For America's brief little moment of imperialism at the end of the 19th century, its biggest campaign will easily be the Spanish-American War. This war isn't like many wars I'm sure you know. Essentially it started because Cuba didn't want to be controlled by Spain anymore, and the US was willing to support Cuba in that regard. Propaganda was also a big part with the growth of yellow journalism, and the other part to this is the sinking of the US ship, the USS Maine. Now, it's not actually truly known what really caused the explosion that sank this ship, but it didn't really matter because US propaganda at the time blamed it on Spain. As for the war, it was actually quite quick. The US will fight Spain, and the war will be fought in Cuba and the Philippines, and the US Navy will crush Spain quickly. The decisive battle of this war will be the Battle of Manila Bay, and a big propaganda group that will get traction here is the Rough Riders, which was led by Theodore, or better known as Teddy Roosevelt. This war will end with a treaty that we will happily add to our list of the mini Treaty of Parises. This treaty will cause Spain to give up Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Puerto Rico will quietly become a US territory, Guam will quietly become a US naval base, and the Philippines will become a colony of the US for $20 million. But they will not go quietly at all. This will trigger a Philippine-American War, where Filipinos led by Emilio Aguinaldo will want independence. And the US will suppress this nationalist movement severely. As for Cuba, it will technically be independent, but basically the US will have a shitload of soldiers occupy the country and impose a controlling Platt Amendment. So I'll leave the debating up to you whether or not that's truly independent. The other outcome of this war is that the US will finally be involved with Asia and open up a lot of trade with different Asian countries like China. Welcome to the Progressive Era. Yes, it's truly time to talk about the era following the Gilded Age. Let's quickly define the progressive movement in one sentence. Progressives responded to political corruption, social injustice, and economic inequality created and heightened by industrial capitalism and urbanization. And I don't want you to sit there and think this progressive movement was one big unified group, because it really wasn't. Rather, it was a bunch of little movements that had a lot of things in common, which is why we roped them together into one big progressive movement. Reformers were often middle to upper class, and many were women working especially in cities and among immigrant populations. The biggest thing you'll see in this movement is something called muckrakers. This means a journalist / writer whom investigates wrongdoing. Let's go through some key figures in this regard. Upton Sinclair was a muckraker who wrote the famous The Jungle. This book exposed disgusting meatpacking and pushed for food regulations. Ida Tarbell is a muckraker who investigated Standard Oil and exposed their probably illegal monopoly tactics. And finally, Jacob Rees is a muckraker who made the book How the Other Half Lives, where the book is packed full of photos and reports exposing the horrid tenement housing conditions. Moving on, let's go over a different section of the progressive movement, the political side. Here we'll look at two people, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt argued for a quote square deal, where he pleaded to rein in corporations, protect consumers, and conserve natural resources. Wilson argued for a quote new freedom by restoring economic opportunity by breaking up monopolies, lowering tariffs, and reforming the banking system. Notice how both of these ideals are trying to regulate and reform most of what the Gilded Age stood for. That being said, there would also be a movement of women's rights. We already talked about the roots of this back in Unit 4 with the Seneca Falls Convention, though later, I did forget to mention Susan B. Anthony, so apologies about that. But now you have activists like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, along with a lot of women rallying behind the movement. This women's movement will continue to grow and will eventually contribute a lot to 2 amendments later on. Now let's move over to African American rights. Many progressives were split or simply ignored segregation as a whole. As for people advocating for black rights, you have Booker T. Washington, whom we talked about earlier, and a new one for you, W.E.B. Du Bois, who simply demanded full civil rights. Finally, the last 2 progressive movements were immigration and the environment. Immigration exposed a split down the middle. Some progressives pushed restrictions, while others focused on supporting immigrants in cities. Environmental reform followed a similar pattern, dividing into preservationists, who wanted to protect nature for its own sake, and conservationists, who emphasized responsible long-term resource management. Despite their differences, both supported the creation of national parks. Welcome to the APUSH version of World War I. If you wonder why I have to preface that by saying APUSH version, it's because this war is technically mostly an aspect of European history. I mean, the war started in Europe, it mostly happened in Europe, and it ended in Europe. So from a US history perspective, I would personally love to go in and explain every tiny little battle and complexity of this war, but I can't. All I'm gonna do here is give you a little bit of context and explain the US side of things. So basically, by 1914, all these European powers had a bunch of weapons, they were all entangled in a bunch of alliances, and most of all, they were all pretty full of themselves. After some dude got assassinated, one country declared war on another country, which would cause a big domino reaction because of the alliances we talked about earlier, which is why my favorite historical newspaper has got to be this amazing one from The Onion. So anyway, this war happens for a while, and by 1916, the war stalemates into 2 big battles of trench warfare at Verdun and the Somme. But if you're wondering what the US is doing, basically nothing is the answer. The US wanted to maintain neutrality during this war. However, it still sent ships full of supplies to its allies. But then you see 2 big things happen. First is Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare kept sinking ships with Americans on them. The most famous of this was the sinking of the Lusitania. Then by 1917, after the sinking started up again, America got one more push to enter the war, the Zimmermann telegram. This was an encrypted message to Mexico from Germany intercepted by Britain. It basically tried to get Mexico to declare war on the US if the US entered the war. So this, plus the constant sinking of civilian ships, caused America to enter the war in April of 1917. Now I want you to understand, the American soldiers sent to Europe, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, played a relatively limited role in combat. That being said, this combined with constant American supplies allowed the war to tip in favor of the Allies, and eventually Germany would lose. This war would end with the Treaty of Versailles, and this will easily be probably one of the most biggest controversies in world history. This treaty will basically force all blame of the war on Germany and cause them to pay an insane amount of reparations. The US president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, also wanted to create a League of Nations to try and ally to make sure a war like this can never happen again. However, Wilson will fail to bring a Republican to the discussion, which will cause him to lose Republican support in Congress, and ironically, despite him coming up with the idea, Congress will choose for the US not to join the League of Nations. And just for numbers sakes here, about 20 million people died in World War I, and for reference, only about 100,000 will be from the US. The last video we talked about World War I in Europe. However, this is US history, so why don't we now go back to America and take a look at what it's like during and after the war. Here's a good rule to go by. For both world wars and American history, America is gonna become kind of unstable. I mean, we already know lots of America is racist. I mean, Jim Crow laws still exist and are still being enforced quite a lot. But now there are genuine threats in Europe that America declares as enemies when they enter the war, and so during and after the war, many Americans will become more willing to limit civil liberties, especially freedom of speech, because of anxiety about disloyalty, radical political ideas, and labor unrest. Good examples here are the Espionage and Sedation Acts, which were acts that criminalized anti-war speech and the use of, quote, disloyal language. You also have the American Protective League, or the APL, who literally volunteered to report suspicious people. And after the Russian Revolution started in 1917, a period in American history known as the First Red Scare happened, where there was a big fear that communists, anarchists, and other radicals were threatening the United States. Now let's transition and talk about immigration, because before World War I, immigration from Europe reached very high levels. After the war, nativism, which was the belief that the interests of native-born Americans should be protected against immigrants, increased. This is where you now see quotas being implemented, like the Emergency Quota Act and the 1924 Immigration Act, which would both place numerical limits on immigration by creating quotas based on national origin. A quick note that because of increased increased wartime production, there was a big movement of people from small towns into big industrial cities for factory work. Now, this factory work will mostly be in the north, and a whole bunch of African Americans still live down south where they are being forced to adhere to Jim Crow laws and have basically no economic opportunities. So now when word gets out that the north has lots of high-paying factory jobs available, something known as the Great Migration happens, where a bunch of African Americans will move out of the south to the north. Now, this would create new black communities, but I do want to teach something that actually is rarely taught in American history. That is something known as the Red Summer of 1919. This is an effect of the Great Migration, where there will be a lot of white mobs attacking black communities in dozens of US cities and towns. Oh, the Roaring 20s. What a time to be alive. Oops, sorry, but that's actually supposed to be next topic. Lots of people like studying the 1920s in American history because of how much cool culture there was, which is why we refer to it as the Roaring 20s. Right now, we're going to talk about what facilitated and caused this quote Roaring 20s. Basically, this comes down to two things: new technology and mass media. Let's first talk about the technology, and for this we will look at two people. Let's start with Henry Ford. Ford here popularized something very revolutionary known as assembly lines, meaning he broke down production into simple repeated steps, causing a faster output, which would then cause the price of goods to go down. The second part to this is something called scientific management, where you prioritize efficiency over everything else. The man attributed to this is a man named Frederick Taylor. Oh, and before we move on, the biggest innovation in this time period, and arguably in the entirety of world history, will be the automobile. It's truly indescribable how much the automobile changes everything. Commuting changes, roads will be built, gas stations and motels are made, and it would cause an unforeseen level of suburban growth. But now let's go over to our second thing and talk about the media. Because other than the automobile, you have two more things that boomed in this time period: cinema and the radio. With cinema, we are obviously talking about the growth of Hollywood and movies, which would give Americans shared celebrities, fashion, slang, and even values. The more impactful one here though is probably radios, because now instead of waiting for a newspaper, people can have live broadcasts, news, music, sports, advertising, and the big importance here is that people across the country are all listening to the same stuff. This created a consumer economy, meaning people are buying appliances, cars, and entertainment, often through credit and installment plans. This would also facilitate the means of which cultures will spread across America throughout the 20s, especially regional ones, and make something like the Roaring 20s possible. Oh, the Roaring 20s, what a time to be alive. So much culture defined this era of American history, so why don't we walk down this 1920s street and explore some cultural phenomena. The first stop on this street is the lovely bar, which we call a speakeasy, because obviously alcohol was illegal in this time period after the 18th Amendment. Look at those lovely flappers dancing on stage, while behind them a jazz band fills the room with fast-paced rhythms that symbolize a break from tradition and the rise of a new American sound. The bar is packed with people from different backgrounds, a rare sight for the time, all gathered in defiance of one thing: prohibition. But the bar isn't the only thing we see. Our next stop is Harlem, New York, where the Great Migration has caused a surge of African American culture known as the Harlem Renaissance. In the building down the street, I think I see two people: Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, who are proving that black people can write great literature. But coming up closer, I see two great artists of Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong, creating and performing lovely jazz to all that can behold it. Our last stop here is the local library, where women finally gain new visibility in society with their new right to vote in women's suffrage movement. And I think I even catch a sight of Alice Paul in the corner helping out. Man, this era of American history is truly something special. Ahem. Alright, that's enough of that. Yes, this era looks incredible on the surface. However, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's all kind of empty and trashy below the surface. Prohibition causes widespread crime and the growth of civil unrest. On top of numerical quotas, immigrants get treated even worse with these two Supreme Court decisions. And though this era is defined by vast amounts of money everywhere, you gotta remember what comes literally right after this era. The 1920s is all surface level, and the reason it will collapse so quickly when the Depression hits is because everything is built on beliefs and borrowed money. The whole era seems cute and incredible on the surface, but truly everything you see is hanging on a tight thread. So before we end this topic, I think it's only right, since we talked about all the good, let's talk about the famous bad things that happened in the 20s. The Scopes monkey trial upheld a Tennessee law banning the teaching of evolution. In Buck vs. Bell, the Supreme Court ruled that it was okay to remove some people's ability to have children, known as sterilization. And finally, Nicola Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti had a very unfair murder trial, likely because of their Italian heritage, and they got sentenced to death and executed despite their likely innocence. On the surface, surface, the 1920s was great. It truly was. I mean, do you remember back to Units 1 and 2 of this course, where we talked about America being founded on people living in the rural countryside? Now we have gone so far with so many big corporations that in the 20s, it will be the first time in American history where there's more people living in big urban cities than in the rural countryside. So if the 20s are so glamorous, how exactly can something like the Great Depression even happen? Here's your answer, with 4 reasons. The first is simply overproduction, because the American economy was so industrial that during the 20s, it produced more goods than people could buy. The second is debt, because pretty much all consumers and businesses were deeply in debt. The reason for that is that all the lavish things bought by these people in the 20s were purchased through things like credit and not actual real paper money. The third one here though is a bank/Federal Reserve failure, because banks were giving out risky loans, had little oversight, and collapsed when people rushed to withdraw their money, and the Federal Reserve didn't step in to help. And finally, the fourth reason was the economy around the world was not that great. European economies depended on US loans after World War I, so when US banks collapsed, loans were recalled. And with all these 4 causes in play, it's like a room full of gas that requires one spark for the whole room to go boom. And that spark will be when the stock market crashes in 1929. Pretty quickly, the Great Depression will be devastating. Millions will lose their jobs, homes, and savings. The unemployment rate will shoot up to a staggering 25%. Millions who couldn't afford food lined up in historically long bread lines, where there was never enough food to go around, and people who lost their homes built makeshift shelters out of scrap wood and cardboard, which would make shanty towns known as, quote, Hoovervilles. Families would migrate all over the place to search for work, and children would often go without school. As for the initial federal response, it will be quite weak and be based on voluntary cooperation between businesses and government. Pretty quickly, when this doesn't work, America will redefine itself in the ideas of modern American liberalism. This will call for the regulation of markets, social insurance, and most importantly, responsibility in the hands of government for economic well-being. That means bye-bye laissez-faire. It was nice knowing you. So there's this big misconception through the understanding of US history that the Great Depression happens and right afterwards the New Deal comes along and ends the Great Depression. To put it bluntly, no, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. The technical end comes with the mobilization for World War II. I'd say the New Deal itself is more of something that reshaped the US government. So let's recap here. Herbert Hoover is president, the Depression starts, and poor old lad Hoover over here doesn't really know what to do and is criticized heavily for it. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, came along as the Democratic nominee in the 1932 election, it's a pretty simple and easy victory for him. Fairly quickly, FDR will implement his New Deal plan. And this is quite complex, but to give it a sentence definition, FDR's New Deal will use aggressive government intervention to stabilize the economy, put people back to work, and prevent another depression from happening again. The method that will be used here is something we like to call the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Very quickly, you'll start seeing programs. Let's go through a few of them. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men in environmental and infrastructure projects. There were lots of public work/infrastructure programs that built roads, parks, dams, schools, and public buildings, and separate programs existed for Native Americans, Puerto Rico, and African Americans. If you can't tell, all of these existed so there would be more jobs for people to get. But what I want you to notice here is the big contradiction of what we established back in Unit 6. Do you remember when America functioned on a hands-off approach and letting the economy do its own thing? Now with this New Deal, it will easily be, up to this point in history, the biggest government intervention in its own economy that America has ever had. And since this New Deal changed American policy so much, there was quite a lot of debates on both sides of Roosevelt. Radicals, unions, and populist movements such as Hugh Long and Father Charles Coughlin will push Roosevelt to intervene as much as possible with government efforts. But on the other side, conservatives in Congress and the Supreme Court sought to limit the New Deal's overall scope. An example of this is the Supreme Court case Schrechter Poultry Corp versus the United States, which struck down parts of the National Industry Recovery Act. And finally, the last thing about the New Deal is the institutions it created that still exist to this day. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, and the Social Security Act gave old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid for the disabled. If you can't tell, everything about this New Deal will cause working class communities to identify more with the Democratic Party. So we are currently positioned squarely in the interwar period in American history. So here's a good question to ask after World War I. Should America lead globally or stay out of foreign conflicts? If you want to know the answer to this question, it is mostly to stay out of everything, meaning to be isolationists. However, there were quite a few things that happened that went against this ideology. The first of this is two things. The Dawes Plan was made because Germany could not pay for its reparations and Europe was struggling as a result. So the plan was to loan Germany money, which, after Germany paid their reparations, allowed Britain and France to pay off their US war debts. Then later, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was passed, in which most countries pledged to not solve world problems with war. And if you can't tell, both of these things did not work. The Dawes Plan failed because of the Great Depression, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact failed because there was no way it could be enforced. It's also important to note that the US continued intervention and continued presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, such as in Haiti and Nicaragua. But now we see something else rise in Europe, and that is a very famous mustache man with an ideology of fascism growing very strong. The US sensed war might come and passed a series of neutrality acts which didn't really work, and over in Europe, our good friend Hitler is conquering land and the horrible method of appeasement isn't alleviating it. Once FDR realizes these Axis powers are dangerous, he slowly starts moving away from isolationism, and then, out of nowhere, bam, the naval base Pearl Harbor is bombed by the Axis power Japan, and America officially enters World War II. So the US is now officially in World War II. But to put it bluntly, US entry into World War II required total economic mobilization. That means all the work needed to make cars, tanks, and weapons will cause so much jobs, which effectively will end the Great Depression. And here's another part to this. All the men are getting shipped off to war. That means the people that will step up to do this factory work will mostly be women. That means during the war, women had many new gains as they took over male-dominated jobs. However, it should be noted, many women were pushed out of the jobs after the war when men returned. But women aren't the only one that get opportunities. African Americans do as well. They will also work in factories, however they will face their own share of racism. But the other people that get opportunities here are immigrants and migrants. There will be so much migration to big cities that places like Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, and Detroit will grow like crazy. The specific immigrants I want to mention here are Mexican ones, because you start seeing a vast amount of Mexican immigrants that entered the US during the war under the Bracero program, which allowed Mexican laborers to temporarily work in US agriculture and railroad jobs. I'm sure you can guess, but the response you'll see to this is racism. An example of that is the Zoot Suite riots, where Mexicans and Filipinos were attacked in LA over a series of days. And the last thing I want to say is a lot of people like to say FDR was one of the greatest presidents. I won't really say anything on the matter, but here is something that doesn't look too good on his part. During World War II, fear and racism led FDR to issue an executive order which would force around 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. And these camps were not good in the slightest. It's time to talk about World War II. This war will be like no other in history. The US will directly fight Japan in the Pacific theater, and the Allied powers will fight Germany in Europe. After Pearl Harbor and Congress's declaration of war, Americans will view this war as a fight for the survival of freedom and democracy against fascist and militaristic ideologies. And this view on the war isn't too far off from the truth, because later in the war, it was realized the horrible things the Axis powers were up to. In Germany, minorities with a special emphasis on Jewish citizens will be forced into horrible concentration death camps, where it is said that over 6 million Jewish will die. Over in Japan, their invasion of China will showcase horrific tragedies, such as the rape of Nanking, where Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were mass murdered, raped, and looted. Fascism posed such a threat that this war was about more than just victory or defeat like in World War I. The Allies had to win, or the world would be fundamentally changed. America quickly recognized this, leading to full national mobilization. Industry surged, and women and minorities joined the war effort through groups like the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and Anisai units of Japanese American soldiers. So let's go over to the war now. We'll first talk about the European theater. Basically, by 1944, Germany had conquered France and part of the Soviet Union. On the eastern side, the winter allowed the Soviets to regroup and push back against Germany, with probably the most important turning point battle in world history being the Battle of Stalingrad. On the western side, the Allies needed to push back against Germany, so on June 6, 1944, a combination of American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the northern beaches of France, which was known as D-Day. This was a huge success, and the Allied forces will continue pushing on the west, while the Soviets will push on the east, and eventually, Hitler will be defeated. Now let's head over to the Pacific theater. The turning point battle here is when America will destroy a bunch of Japanese aircraft carriers, and that will happen at the Battle of Midway. After Midway, America will start taking back islands that Japan had conquered during the war. However, this will reveal a grim reality. Japanese soldiers fought with extreme brutality, and their code of honor compelled them to fight to the death, making the island hopping campaign extremely brutal and costly. By the end of the war, America had developed the atomic bomb thanks to the Manhattan Project. This bomb would kill so many people, but it could force the fierce Japanese to surrender. And with so many American soldiers dying in this island hopping, America would be forced to make a difficult choice. And I think Oppenheimer will put it best.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
2 A-bombs will be dropped. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people will die. Japan will surrender, and it will be one of the biggest moral debates for the rest of history. World War II was just simply devastating. Around 80 million people will die over the course of this 6-year-long war. However, the thing about this war from a US history perspective is that this war was pretty much fought everywhere except the US. After the war, Europe and Asia will be devastated in both casualties and land. I mean, just look at these images on the screen. So now the US will have a massive military, industrial capacity, and mostly untouched land, meaning finally, the United States will emerge as the most powerful country in the world upon the conclusion of this war. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences will happen near the end of the war. The key outcomes you should know are that Germany will be divided into occupation zones, Japan will be occupied and rebuilt under US supervision, war crime trials will be held against Nazi leaders, and borders/governments across Europe and Asia will be reorganized. The other consequence of this war is the creation of the United Nations, or UN. This will allow countries to negotiate, prevent wars, and promote cooperation. But very quickly, you'll see the Soviet Union occupy most of Eastern Europe, enforce a communist ideology, which will lead to a different kind of war that we refer to as being very cold. But I think we'll cover that next unit. World War II is now over, and the end of this war will see the rise of 2 major global superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. The thing is, these 2 superpowers were allies during World War II, and pretty much immediately after the war, their alliance collapses. The reason for this is pretty simple. These 2 countries' ideologies are completely different. Over in the US, we have democracy, capitalism, and free markets. However, going over to the Soviet Union, we now have a system known as authoritarian communism, which means the state controls literally everything. So you might think that these 2 countries are going to go to war, but the world just went through a horribly devastating war, and now things like nuclear weapons exist. If another war were to happen, it's not unreasonable to say that the world could quite literally come to an end. So the thing that emerges, the Cold War, isn't a normal war at all. It will be a 45-year-long series of smaller conflicts and tensions that, over time, add up to one massive, quote, Cold War. So from 1945 to 1980, one thing will remain constant. Containment, simply meaning that the US's goal is to stop communism from spreading. This idea comes from George Kennan's Long Telegram, where he argues that the Soviet Union will expand unless firmly contained. So let's give some examples of this containment. First is economic aid. The Truman Doctrine will be made, declaring the US will give money to Greece and Turkey to stop communist influence. Also, the Marshall Plan will be enacted to send billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe after the war. But the second thing here is military alliances. Western democracies will ally under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and later the Soviet Union will respond and create the Warsaw Pact for all of its countries. And now notice that with these new organizations, the world is essentially split in half. Finally, the last thing here will be military conflicts. This is where we see proxy wars like the Korean War, and looking at this, basically North Korea is communist and wants to invade the democratic South Korea. The US will ally with the South, the communist China will ally with the North, and the war happens, and after 3 years it will end in a draw. Cool. Then the Cuban Missile Crisis will have the Soviets place nuclear missiles in Cuba, the US blockades Cuba, the world nearly ends, but all is good after some negotiation. But by the 1970s, this Cold War had really gone on for long enough. Vietnam is something that we'll cover later in this unit, but let's just say that the US was not having a great time in Vietnam. Under Nixon, various treaties and open communications between the US and China/the Soviet Union will happen, and the key method of the Cold War will now turn to something called détente, meaning to ease tensions. There are also so many other parts to this Cold War that I do not have time to go over. Just understand that the US used a lot of different strategies over the years to manage the Soviet threat. On the Cold War, it isn't exactly limited to conflicts with the Soviet Union. I mean, yes, that is the definition on paper, but the Cold War will also cause a lot of things to happen specifically in America. Specifically for this video, I want to talk to you about the Red Scare. But before that, let's head over to post-World War II Europe. Despite the US's efforts to contain communism communism. In 1949, the Soviet Union gets an atomic bomb. And also in 1949, China will become communist. And right after that, in 1950, the Korean War starts. With all this happening so quickly, fear began to grow that communism might reach the United States. And that fear will cause an era known as the Second Big Red Scare, where anti-communist paranoia in America will lead to blacklisting, ruined reputations, and widespread intimidation. And the big person I want to mention here is a senator named Joseph McCarthy. And for all you Gen Z kids, this man is the perfect definition of a rage baiter. He basically claimed communists were everywhere in the government, but often had little to no evidence to back it up. And I think this perfectly encapsulates this era, because now we see accusations of communism without any proof, careers being destroyed left and right as a result, and all of it really just leading to a massive public fear. And this will also lead to serious limits on civil liberties, especially freedom of speech. Now let's give some examples of things that happened in the Red Scare. Truman's Executive Order 9835, also known as the Loyalty Order, investigated government employees for quote disloyalty and led to thousands losing their jobs. The House Un-American Activities Committee investigated suspected communists with a special focus on Hollywood, where specifically in Hollywood, 10 writers, directors, and screenwriters were cited and blacklisted from the industry. And finally, there were actual real espionage cases, such as Alger Hiss, but the more dramatic one here was probably the Rosenbergs, where, after these two were convicted of selling secrets to the Soviet Union, they were executed by electric chair. But moving on, by the end of the 50s, pushback against McCarthyism, such as criticism by Margaret Chase Smith, will inevitably cause paranoia to die down, and the whole Red Scare by the end of the 50s will essentially dissipate. But just remember, even though people argued about methods, both political parties in this era agree that communism must be stopped. So World War II is over. And looking at America from an economic standpoint, after World War II, America goes through massive economic growth. And there is a lot of reasons for this. Large corporations expand rapidly, meaning more goods are produced, and more of a consumer economy develops. Also of note is that the federal government played a major role in boosting the economy. Let's go through a few very important things. The GI Bill provided all these millions of World War II veterans with money for college, housing, and business loans. And the Interstate Highway Act launched a massive road building project, which is the reason there are all of these highways around the country. So with the economy being strong, people wanted more babies. And that's where we see a massive spike in the birth rate post-World War II, known as the baby boom. And more people in the world means more of a demand for houses and goods, which is where we see all of these technologies on the screen being manufactured in this time period, which contributed more to the greater economic boom. So now we see a couple of things. The country's economy is very strong, goods are being bought and sold at high levels, and now there are roads all over the place. So the result of this will be a lot of migration. Specifically, millions of middle-class Americans moved from big cities to suburbs. The reason for this is pretty simple. Roads make transportation way faster, there is affordable housing with FHA loans in the GI Bill, and also lots of houses are being built. And the thing I want to reference here is mass-produced neighborhoods full of houses that look the exact same, which was very common in this time period, known as a levee town. A good area where people migrated to was the Sun Belt, all because of the recently invented air conditioning, which made living in this hot region more plausible. However, despite all of the economic improvements, you have to understand that you had to be a very specific skin color to get access to these improvements. That's right, government-backed housing policies often excluded minorities. This was known as redlining, by the way, and this would mean suburban growth was racially unequal. Take a look at this man. He looks pretty cool. But then, take a look at the guy next to him. It's the same dang person. Yeah, that's right, this is basically the 1950s in American history. The reason I say that is because during the 50s, people across the country started living very similar lives, meaning American culture became increasingly homogeneous. Now, it's pretty easy to see why this is the case. The television becomes massive and every American is watching them. And to add to that, TV shows promote a nuclear family, meaning where the husband works and the wife stays at home. Shows also showed suburban life and traditional gender roles. So now everyone is watching and being influenced by the same things. But it's not just that. The economic boom of the 50s also means everyone is buying the same stuff, such as cars, appliances, and again, TVs. And now with Americans living in the suburbs, again remember, this is what an American neighborhood looks like. It's all the same. So when you look at the 50s in American history from a cultural standpoint, the big label you can truly give it is calling it conformist, meaning people are following the same norms, expectations, and lifestyles. Now, though what I said said is all true, it wasn't technically all the same. There is some pushback against conformity in this time period. Let's go through some examples. The Beat movement happened, where writers and poets rejected consumerism and traditional values. Rock and roll surged with artists like Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley. I mean, listen to this song by Elvis. Sorry, that's all I can play so I don't get copyrighted. The last two things here are intellectual criticism of aspects of American culture, and also there were early movements in the LGBTQ+ movement, with an example being the Mattachine Society, which were one of the earliest, most influential US gay rights organizations. Hello there, to start this video, I want to flash back to my final Unit 5 video where I said this.
Reconstruction was the US's first attempt at civil rights, and it failed miserably, but the 14th and 15th Amendments didn't go away. They became the legal foundation for the civil rights movement 100 years later.
So yeah, it's finally 100 years later, and it's time to talk about the civil rights movement. So let's look at a typical group of Black Americans in the 1950s. You might be surprised to know this, but at this time, blacks were legally forced to go to separate schools, use different bathrooms and water fountains, sit in the back of buses, and were often blocked from voting, certain jobs, and even neighborhoods, all because of the color of their skin. So now, a lot of black soldiers fought for freedom in World War II, and then they come back to legally sanctioned segregation at home. This was not sustainable anymore. So the big African American rights organization, the NAACP, went for a very specific strategy to combat segregation. And that strategy was challenging segregation in courts, with a big lawyer in this regard being Thurgood Marshall. And this will all lead to our three branches of government acting, albeit at different times. In the executive branch, Truman will desegregate the military. In the judicial, the very important Brown versus Board of Education case happens, which declared school segregation as unconstitutional, meaning it overturned Plessy v. Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine. And finally, in the legislative branch, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed. It was pretty weak and didn't really do much, but it is symbolic as the first civil rights law since Reconstruction. So now we see this civil rights movement expand. For example, courts became key battlegrounds for arguing civil rights. And obviously, we have our two main civil rights organizations, and who can forget the lady who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus? That's right, Rosa Parks. Claudette Colvin. Oh, and I guess Rosa Parks also did it too. After Rosa Parks got arrested for not giving up her bus seat to a white man, the black community in Montgomery responded by boycotting the entire bus system, causing it to lose a lot of money, with a key figure growing here being Martin Luther King Jr. This would lead to bus segregation being ruled unconstitutional in Browder v. Gale. And finally, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students enrolled at a previously all-white high school. The governor of Arkansas didn't like this and tried to block these students from entering school by sending in the National Guard to block them, and violent racism erupted as crowds protested their entry. So despite Brown v. Board ruling segregation illegal, Arkansas didn't care. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to act. So what he did was take control of the National Guard away from the governor of Arkansas, and even sent his own troops to ensure the students could enter the school safely. It's been a second since we've talked about it, so let's head on over back to the Cold War. Last time we talked a lot about the Cold War in Europe and also in the US, but now the Cold War will expand to all over the world. Let's first head over to Latin America. And really quickly, the key point I want to make here before I talk about anything is that the US will support any government that is anti-communist, even if it's not democratic. So over in Guatemala, the US sees a leader who makes controversial, potentially communist influence, land reforms. So the CIA helps overthrow him. Over in Chile, a socialist democracy is made with another democratically elected guy, and so the US supported his coup d'etat. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Cuba was a country directly aligned with the Soviet Union, so the US decides to launch an invasion known as the Bay of Pigs. And through a lot of reasons, it completely fails. But now moving over to Africa and the Middle East, most of these newly formed countries tried to stay out of the Cold War, meaning they were quote non-aligned. However, the US still intervened a bit. The US will help overthrow a leader in Iran, help negotiate peace between Egypt and Israel, and in Angola, there was a proxy war between the USSR and the US. Honestly, it's a dang chess match. That is the best way I can describe the Cold War. But unlike a chess match, there were actual consequences. And that was the nuclear threat of a fear of annihilation. That is where a concept of MAD is declared, which means mutually assured destruction. Meaning if one side launches nukes, the other side is gonna do the same. Sure, this does prevent war, but it will also lead to a massive arms buildup, and debates around America will spark up about spending in the military. This will even lead to Eisenhower warning about the quote quote, military-industrial complex, where he warned that government plus military plus corporations held way too much power in the United States. So this Cold War is intense in many ways, but it is not over by a long shot, and it's time to talk about one of its biggest conflicts, which was the Vietnam War. So let's look at a map of Southeast Asia. After defeating France, Vietnam split into the communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the non-communist South Vietnam, and almost immediately the two sides go to war. The US's thinking here will be the domino theory, which was the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian countries would follow. So the US essentially just wanted to contain communism's spread. So it starts off pretty simple. The US will start by sending money and advisors, but then the Gulf of Tonkin incident happens, where two US boats are attacked by North Vietnam. Now, in retrospect, this incident was very exaggerated and parts of it were likely made up, but it didn't really matter because it caused the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, to use the incident to justify full military involvement in Vietnam by the US. And so, the US will officially enter Vietnam. It will implement a full military draft and send hundreds of thousands of untrained young boys to fight, and it will quickly become a full-on war. Once the US is fully involved in Vietnam, the war quickly becomes a nightmare, because it isn't a traditional fight. Communist soldiers who supported the North but fought in the South were called the Viet Cong, and they do not operate like regular soldiers. Instead, they move within South Vietnam. Using the Ho Chi Minh Trail for supplies, they blend in with civilians and rely on ambushes, booby traps, and tunnel systems. This makes it incredibly difficult for millions of US soldiers to tell who the enemy is. So then you see a few things happen. The Tet Offensive happens in Vietnam, where North Vietnamese soldiers launch a massive series of surprise attacks on the South, and then the Pentagon Papers get released, showing that US leaders had been secretly expanding and misrepresenting the war, while lying to the public saying that things were under control. And finally, the My Lai massacre happens, where US soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. All of these combined together cause the US public to most openly despise this war. The result here is college protests, widespread draft resistance, and cultural divide. This will lead to the War Powers Act, which basically said that the president can't just drag the US into war without Congress. And finally, when Nixon becomes president, he begins pulling US soldiers out of Vietnam until finally in 1975, the US officially exits the war. North Vietnam wins, and Vietnam becomes communist. How about that? For once in history, the US actually loses. So back over in America, even though the economy was booming by the 60s, people start realizing that not everyone is benefiting. A book that acted as a very good expose was The Other America by Michael Harrington. Basically, this book revealed that there was a hidden poverty in America, revealing the struggles of millions of poor Americans. And then on top of this, because of the result of World War II and the economic boom of the 50s, by the 1960s, American citizens have almost full confidence in its own liberal government and thinks the government can solve social issues. This will all lead President Lyndon B. Johnson to enact his Great Society, which was an expansion of the New Deal focused on social issues rather than just the economy, aiming to end poverty, reduce racial inequality, improve education, and expand healthcare. Let's go over the things the Great Society created. Programs focusing on poverty will be implemented, such as the Job Corps for job training, Head Start for early childhood education, and the Food Stamp Act for food assistance. Healthcare programs will also be implemented, such as Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor. It's also important to note that this plan for a Great Society often worked alongside the ongoing civil rights movement at the time. The other part to this, though, is immigration, and we see this with the Immigration Act of 1965, where finally quotas are removed, meaning we see a lot more immigration from Latin America and Asia, which permanently changed US demographics. So you might be asking now, was this Great Society a good success or bad overall? Well, it obviously did have successes that we still see in our society to this day, but I want you to understand something. Remember the Gilded Age, where America had a very small government and didn't intervene in its economy at all? Remember the whole laissez-faire thing? Now we have gone through the New Deal, World War II, and now the Great Society, so the result is the US government is as big as it has ever been, and it is intervening as much in its own economy as it ever has. Conservatives on the right will argue that the government is way too big now, and later, past the 70s into the 80s, things like Vietnam and a lot of government spending will cause mass inflation and unemployment, leading to a growing distrust in government and a resulting age of conservatism, but I get ahead of myself. It's time to talk about the official African-American civil rights movement. We already talked about the roots of this with Rosa Parks, the bus boycott, and the Little Rock Nine, but pretty quickly the movement expands even bigger. bigger. So here's what you need to know. During the early part of the civil rights movement in the 60s, the overall goal was non-violent protest, because violence would undermine the goal of the movement. The leader of this movement will be a man named Martin Luther King Jr. So why don't we go through some examples of this movement? Sit-ins were protests where black activists sat at segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until served. Freedom rides happened where people of many races sat in white-only sections of buses throughout the South to challenge segregation. And finally, there were a lot of marches in big cities. For example, in the March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. went up on a stage and gave his I Have a Dream speech, where he pleaded to thousands of people about his dreams of a world without blatant segregation. And it would easily become one of the most famous speeches in world history. And by this point, the nonviolent movement had gotten so big that it finally pushed real federal action. The 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed, which completely ends segregation and bans discrimination. The Voting Rights Act is also passed, which protected black voting rights. And also, the other two branches of government do a few things as well. Here is the issue though, because even if the federal government passed all these laws, poverty still exists, racism still exists, and urban violence actually steadily rises. And this is where the civil rights movement will essentially split in half. On one side, you have the Martin Luther King inspired nonviolent protests, but now on the other side, you have a growing group of people advocating for more aggressive measures like self-defense, black pride, and economic independence. A leader to reference here is Malcolm X. This second movement based on black power gets really popular and leads to groups like the Black Panthers, who again advocate for more aggressive measures. It's also important to note that these two very important leaders will get assassinated, which definitely does not help the nonviolent side of things. So there is an obvious split here, and this will mean by the midpoint of the 60s, the civil rights movement is not necessarily one thing anymore. It is a movement divided behind different methods, full of a lot of ongoing struggles. So this African American civil rights movement has gotten really big by the 60s. So the big idea here is, all these other groups of minorities are seeing the success of this big movement and are getting inspired to do something similar with their group. We have 5 groups to go over in this video, so let's get into it. Latinos will start the Chicano movement, where leaders like Cesar Chavez will form the United Farm Workers to fight low wages and poor working conditions. An example of things they did were non-violent things, such as a national consumer boycott of California table grapes. This would lead to union contracts, better wages, and safer working conditions. Moving on though, American Indians formed their own movement as well. The goal here was to reclaim their own rights and protest government treatment. The two big things that happened here were that Native American groups would forcibly occupy the prison Alcatraz and the town of Wounded Knee in an effort to protest the federal government. But now let's move over to Asian Americans. This one was more focused on giving Asians their own identity in America, and lots of what you see here are college protests against anti-Asian racism. Now let's move over to feminism. If you remember in the past, we had our era of first wave feminism. Now we are in the technical second wave, where women are going to advocate for full equal rights, such as equal pay, workplace equality, and an equal rights amendment. An organization here popularized was the National Organization for Women, or NOW. And a really important book made here was Bessie Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which exposed the lack of fulfillment an American housewife truly has. And finally, the LGBTQ+ community had their own movement as well to try and fight discrimination and demand recognition. A key turning point in this movement was the Stonewall riots, which would eventually lead to a later gay liberation movement. So let's go over a few things right now. The Vietnam War is causing millions of young men to be drafted, the Pentagon Papers has exposed the government lies and caused a mass distrust, and the civil rights movement is proving that protesting can work to change the norm. And so the result we see here is the youngsters of society starting to question authority and rebel. We already talked about instances of this like college protests and marches, but a very important event I haven't mentioned is the Kent State Massacre, where a large group of students at Kent State University were protesting Vietnam, one thing led to another, and 4 people ended up being shot and killed by the US National Guard in the crowd. But moving on, now what we see is a new variation of left in society called the Students for a Democratic Society, who believed the government wasn't doing enough socially, but was too aggressive militarily. This group criticized things like war, inequality, and government power. And the final form of this youth culture is the formation of a counterculture social rebellion. This is where you see the hippies of the 60s, rejecting traditional jobs, gender roles, and materialism. This will create a more rebellious, informal society. Here is a good way to remember the hippie movement. Peace, love, sex, and a whole lot of grass, which is slang for lots and lots and lots of drugs. So in this time period, finally it is realized by American society that the environment essentially exists. The reason behind this is because a lot of bad environment-related things happen all at once. This river, which I'm not going to pronounce the name of, literally caught on fire. This town was built upon a bunch of toxic waste, causing a surge of diseases such as cancer, and this power plant almost completely melted down. And from all of this, people start to realize industrial growth just might be messing up the environment. Oh, but it gets worse. Of course, what I'm referring to here is the energy crisis, where basically there were severe fuel shortages in the Middle East the US depended on, causing prices at gas stations to spike and for there to be historically long gas station lines. This will all finally cause some environmental action. Let's go through some examples. The Environmental Protection Agency will be created. The Clean Air Act will limit emissions, and the Endangered Species Act will protect endangered animals/plants. As for energy, the Department of Energy will be created, and the US will shift to focus more on energy independence. The 1950s and 1960s. There is a big word I want to throw out there and say trust, because these two eras of American history saw many people trust the American liberal government. And now I want to put it bluntly, as we are in the 70s, the optimism of the 50s and early 60s is now gone. Vietnam is an utter failure and causes people to distrust the government. But then the truly infamous Watergate scandal happens, where President Richard Nixon covers up a burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, revealing widespread illegal surveillance and political sabotage, leading to Nixon's presidential resignation in 1974. And not to mention, the 1970s American economy had high inflation and growing unemployment, which is a very rare economic phenomenon called stagflation. When we get into Jimmy Carter's presidency, it doesn't get much better. The energy crisis moves into full effect, a hostage crisis in Iran made the government appear ineffective, and now by this point, distrust in the United States government by its own citizens is at an all-time high. The liberals in society have dominated the political landscape for so long now, dating all the way back to the New Deal. But now, with this combination of things, conservatives are gonna rise through the cracks. Conservatives will have an ideology of thinking the government is way too big, so they want less regulation, a stronger military, and a pushback to traditional values. Not to mention, you also see a rise of evangelical Christianity, which will become more intertwined with politics, specifically intertwining with the conservative side. This will lead to the 80s later, where conservatism will take over. So in our last unit, we've established that by the 80s, citizens of America have lost confidence in the greater American government for a variety of reasons. So now, coming back into this, people start to think maybe the government is the problem, not the solution. And that right there is the opening for conservatives. Enter Ronald Reagan. He will argue that the government is too big, taxes are too high, regulations hurt businesses, welfare programs don't actually fix poverty, and that society needs more, quote, traditional values. And after Ronald Reagan gets elected, pretty quickly an economic system called Reaganomics is enacted. This is broken into three parts. First, you have tax cuts, meaning that people plus businesses keep more money. The second here is deregulation, meaning that there will be fewer government rules on industries. And finally, you have supply side economics, where helping businesses grow is supposed to help everyone, meaning more jobs, more goods, and a stronger economy overall. But anyway, I'm sure you were wondering whether or not this is a good or bad idea. Well, it's not really my place to say. Rather, what I will do here is objectively explain what both political sides thought of this, and you can decide whether it's good or bad yourself. Conservatives would argue that Reaganomics would grow the economy, make inflation go down, and allow businesses to expand, but the liberals, on the other hand, would argue Reaganomics basically mostly benefited the rich and would cause the wealth gap and the US deficit to grow. And also, something important to note is that even though Reagan wanted a smaller government, programs like Social Security and Medicare stay, along with an increased military spending, so the government really stays a similar size. But before I end this video, I want to mention that this rise in conservatism was very impactful, mostly because the 1980s wasn't even that long ago. Modern politics to this day still debate ideologies from the 80s and beyond. And also, these conservative 80s weren't even totally political. You will also see evangelical Christians rise into supporting and aligning with the conservative side, so now it has a clear social effect. Hey there, do you remember that whole Cold War thing that has been going on for a while now? Well, it actually is going to end in this video with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, really quickly, I want to say that the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a very complex topic, and there is way too many reasons for it. So just understand that this video might be an oversimplification. But anyway, historians often like to blame three people for the Soviet Union's collapse: Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Mikhail Gorbachev. For Reagan's side, the US will build a massive military with increased spending, focusing on defending against nuclear missiles, and the program here was called SDI, or the nickname Star Wars. Reagan also pushed strong anti-communist rhetoric, even going as far to call the Soviet Union a quote evil empire. In fact, let's roll that clip.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Oof. Apply ice to the burned area, my goodness. And finally, the last thing here is that Reagan eventually worked with the Soviet Union in a series of meetings to reduce tensions. But moving on, for Pope John Paul II, he helped push anti-communist beliefs in Poland and ignited a massive solidarity movement, which was a big blow to the Soviet Union. But the final person here, and probably the most important, is Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union starting in 1985. Basically, Gorbachev is not like his predecessors. He was instead a lot less strict. And by this point, the USSR is struggling to keep up financially with the US. In response, Gorbachev releases government reforms that attempt to fix society, but instead totally weaken the Soviet government. And finally, countries controlled under the Soviet Union began to break away until 1989, where the Berlin Wall officially falls, and a few years later, the Soviet Union collapses, ending the Cold War. So now I want you to think about something. Since there is no more USSR rival, the US is going to be the most powerful nation in the world. And after this, it's also important to note, the US is still going to intervene around the world for various reasons like peacekeeping and regional conflicts. And now I am sure you can imagine, lots of different debates about the US's role in the world will start up. Lots of people throughout the last century in American history have been working in factories. I mean, it was the whole point of the Gilded Age. But now with the Cold War mostly over, countries with a specific emphasis on China are going to open up to trade. So that begs the question, if it is cheaper to globalize and pay Chinese workers to produce goods, rather than paying a lot of money to American workers, why the heck would any business stay localized in America? And this will lead to one of the biggest shifts in world history called globalization, where businesses operate globally, meaning companies can produce goods in other countries, and there is a big trade increase. And pretty quickly, looking at the United States, factory jobs dry up relatively quickly. And now you see new age technology come out at a very crucial point. So that means now after the 80s, the US job market will shift to mostly encapsulate service jobs, meaning things like retail, healthcare, finance, education, or tech. This means how people work, how businesses operate, and how people communicate all drastically change in a brief period. This also means that labor unions dramatically decline alongside factory jobs. And I want to point out that this new technology, like the internet and computers, really does change everything. For example, later you have social media, along with stuff like remote work becoming a possibility. You also see a spike in production because new technology makes it so workers can produce more in less time. But wherever there is light, there is also darkness. And here I want to talk about the bad effects of this new generation. The first here is that wages for middle and working class Americans stagnated, as most economic gains increasingly went to corporations in the top 1%. The second thing here though is a digital divide. Because I want you to imagine that lots of older folks who aren't prone to changing their ways, or might not have access to the new tech, could potentially not adopt the new technological changes, so that means some people benefit a lot from the new tech economy, while many others are left behind.
Hey,
Quick question, do you like being cold? I personally don't really like it, and a lot of Americans actually agree with me, which is why in the 1980s, millions of Americans will migrate to the Sun Belt. The reason being hotter temperatures and opportunities, which will cause these regions to gain more political power. But moving on, after 1965, when that whole Immigration Act was passed, immigration steadily rose following the 60s, but then you see it spike like crazy in the 1980s. And this happens because of a collection of things. The first thing is that the US enacted the Refugee Act of 1980, which just simply adopted a humanitarian approach to admitting and resettling refugees. But the bigger thing here is a whole lot of bad things around the world happened all at once. For example, Mexico Mexico and Cuba both go through an economic crisis. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua all go through civil wars. Communism will force thousands to flee from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and Iran also goes through a revolution. And many people also left the Philippines, Korea, and India. Now, you don't need to necessarily memorize these all. I just want to show you that a lot of stuff happened all at once, which caused so many different immigrants to enter the United States in the 1980s. The big effect you see here is what our society has become now in the present. America is so culturally diverse as a country that there are so many bilingual communities and lots of culture from other countries I am sure you see all over the place. And another big effect of this is that immigrants will often fill many blue-collar jobs, meaning many labor-based jobs, in America. But the other big thing this leads to is the modern debates surrounding immigration. Things like border control, legal versus illegal immigration, bilingual education, and the more complex assimilation versus multiculturalism. Welcome to the last topic of AP US History in under 3 minutes. My intro here will just be to simply say thank you to you all for a wonderful year together, and let's get into it. So not to be abrupt here, but 9/11. It is an event we all know. Planes will crash into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in a coordinated terrorist attack carried out by the group Al-Qaeda. This is shocking to the US at the time, and it is a very unprecedented event. And so the US response to this will be to enact a war on terror. And if you are like me and wonder how exactly you can enact a war on an ideology, well, really what the war on terror was a war in Afghanistan, targeting the terrorist group responsible for 9/11, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban government that supported the group. And also the war on terror expanded to Iraq for reasons originally justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction. It's also important to note that the US depended a lot on oil coming from the Middle East, and so a lot of complications arose over energy because of the military actions happening in that region. So the US shifts. They don't have Cold War enemies anymore. Their big enemy now is instead terror. And this will even expand to the home front with the Patriot Act, where the US expanded law enforcement surveillance powers and strengthened measures against terrorism financing. If you were a supporter of this act, you might note the need to keep Americans safe, but critics of this act might say this violates civil liberties and privacy rights. But anyway, for one last time, let's look at the US. What can we say at the end of this course? Well, the US is the most powerful nation in the world. That is pretty objective. The US will continue to intervene internationally, influence global politics, and lead economically and militarily. Alright everybody, that is the entire APUSH course over. Please do consider subscribing to my non-educational channel and watching this video, which was a vlog I did on that channel. Thank you all for being with me this year. It has been a lot of fun, and I have enjoyed making these videos quite a lot. That's all for me though, crush that exam, and have a good one everybody.